The dog that refused to bite her. When Arden first arrived at the estate, she didn't cry, not when they wheeled her through the iron gate, not when the others whispered about the girl who couldn't walk, but when she saw the dog locked in the farthest kennel eyes sharp, body trembling, something in her chest broke open. He was a German shepherd, massive and silent. They called him Shadow. Said he had failed his final trial because he didn't bite the intruder. Too soft, one trainer spat. Arden didn't believe that. She saw the way his ears twitched when she passed, how he turned his head just slightly like he was listening for something only she could say. What no one told her was that this dog had once been a weapon. What no one expected was that he'd become her only protector. And what no one dared believe was that together they'd expose a truth that would unravel everything. You're not just about to hear a story of rescue. You're about to witness a quiet revolution on child, one forgotten dog, and the love that saved them both. The morning mist still clung to the grass, thin and silver, as if the land was exhaling in its sleep. Beyond the frost-lined glass, the world was still waking, except for Arden. She had been up since before the sun dared show its face. The wheels of her chair made no sound against the old oak floorboards as she rolled forward, stopping at the wide window that framed the yard like a painting too cruel to turn away from. She positioned herself just right, angling slightly, like she always did, so that she could see the far corner of the kennels. There he was again. A large black and tan German shepherd moved stiffly through the yard, led by a man in a gray hoodie with a short leash and no kindness in his hands. The dog limped barely noticeable, but she saw it. She always saw the things no one else did. He had a proud frame, tall and powerful, even with that slight hitch in his back leg. But it wasn't the limp that held her there. Unmoving, it was his eyes. She couldn't see their color from here, but she could feel them quiet, heavy eyes that looked like they remembered everything. Arden's fingers gripped the armrest of her chair, pale knuckles peeking from beneath soft pink sleeves. The blanket across her lap was the same one she'd had since she was 4. Threadbare now, but warm, familiar, like silence. She didn't speak. Not out loud, not often, but inside her head, the words never stopped. He looks like he's trying not to fall apart, she thought. Her mother, Elena, said that animals didn't feel things the way people did not, the complicated kinds of feelings anyway. But Arden never believed that. How could you look at a creature like that and not feel something break quietly in your chest? A flicker of movement drew her gaze upward. Dorian. Tall, sharp suit, colder eyes. Her stepfather crossed the training field like a man who believed the earth should shift for him. Arden leaned slightly forward, watching the way his mouth didn't move when he looked at the dog, how his hands never reached out, how even his shadow seemed to stand apart from affection. She swallowed hard, a reflex learned not from pain, but from pretending it wasn't there. Don't look at him, she whispered to herself. Look at the dog. The shepherd turned its head then, just for a second, and Arden imagined that it looked toward her window, not at it, through it. That was how it always felt, like the two of them shared a silence the world couldn't touch. Since the accident, her world had been narrowed into corridors and cushions, the soft hush of wheels instead of the wild thump of running feet. Some days, she felt like a shadow in her own home. The staff rarely looked down when they passed. Dorian's guests, important men in polished shoes, never acknowledged her. Even her teachers, over Zoom, spoke too slowly, as if paralysis meant her brain had dulled too. It hadn't. She noticed everything. Every eye twitch, every flinch from the dog when the leash was jerked too hard. Every time he hesitated before moving, as if expecting something to hurt. She knew that feeling. They were two broken things in the same place, taught to behave, to be quiet, to not cause trouble. But Arden didn't want to be fixed if it meant forgetting how she got this way, and she didn't think the dog wanted that either. Behind her, a clock ticked. The light changed from gray-blue to soft gold as the sun climbed. The shepherd was being led back toward the far kennels now. His ears twitched, his head lowered. He didn't resist, but he didn't obey out of loyalty either. Arden reached forward, her fingertips brushing the glass. It was cool against her skin. "I see you," she whispered. No one answered. She didn't expect them to. But in her heart, something settled like maybe the dog already knew. The sharp scent of leather and gun oil clung to the air in the study, though no one ever fired a weapon in there. It was Dorian Hale's favorite kind of theater impression, without evidence. Everything in that room was chosen to project control. Dark mahogany walls, a fireplace, no one lit, war memorabilia framed behind glass, and shelves lined not with books, but with ledgers, records, assets, transactions. Dorian Hale didn't read stories. He wrote contracts. Outside the wide windows that faced the east wing of the property, the Hale Military Canine Training Grounds stretched across 12 acres of scorched, sterile earth. Metal scaffolding towered like skeletons of war machines, obstacle courses twisted into angular mazes, and rows of kennels stood in unnerving silence, neither welcoming nor humane. There were no painted bones, no tennis balls, no barking, only discipline, precision, obedience, and fear. He sipped his espresso black, bitter, unforgiving, and turned toward the monitor wall mounted behind his desk. One of the screens displayed a live feed from Kennel Sector 3. The German Shepherd Shadow stood motionless, eyes locked on a distant point. The handler tugged sharply at his leash. No reaction. Another tug. A flinch. Slight, but visible. Still slow, Dorian muttered, setting down the cup. A soft knock at the door. He didn't answer. It opened anyway. Victor Brandt stepped inside like a storm kept in a human frame-stiff posture, combat boots, and a gaze that never lingered on anything not worth killing. The man's history was stitched with rumors. Ex-military, dishonorably discharged, reappeared in Eastern Europe as a freelance enforcer for private contractors. Dorian didn't care about pasts. Only usefulness. Progress report? Dorian asked, without turning. Victor approached the desk and stood without sitting, just as expected. He responds to 4 of 6 voice cues and both vibration triggers, Victor said. Still resists wheel-based aggression simulation, but the aversion is weakening. And the ramp exposure? He growled yesterday. Today he lunged barely, but he did. It's coming together. Dorian exhaled slowly, like a man tasting the air before giving a final order. I want the timing exact, he said. When the guests arrive, we show transformation. From rogue to tool, violence, then control, shock, then silence. Victor nodded, though something flickered in his jawline, something human. Dorian didn't like that. This is not a rescue dog showcase, Victor. This is a reconditioning protocol, Dorian continued. My investors aren't interested in sentiment. They want results, tactical obedience, emotional override, controlled threat response. And Arden? Victor asked almost reluctantly. Dorian's eyes narrowed slightly. She will be nearby, as planned. The optics require proximity. The dog reacts, the handlers contain, the girl is fine. Everyone sees how easily the risk is neutralized. Victor shifted. There's still risk. Dorian looked at him for the first time. His voice dropped a note colder. She is not my child, he said. She's a placeholder in a will I never agreed to. If I can't rewrite that document, I will rewrite the circumstances. The dog acts. The threat is demonstrated. The girl is a regrettable footnote. Silence thickened between them. Outside, a crow cawed once, then vanished into the gray sky. I don't pay you to grow a conscience, Victor. No, sir, the man replied quietly. You pay me to make it look clean. Dorian turned back to the screen, where Shadow now paced inside his kennel. Agitated, the camera zoomed slightly, capturing the slight tremble in his leg, the injury that had never fully healed, a scar from a battlefield that no longer existed. Good, Dorian said after a moment. Pain keeps them honest. The door shut behind Victor with a heavy finality. Dorian remained alone, surrounded by silence and steel. He walked over to the window and stared across the yard, where the girl in the wheelchair sat, unseen by most, but always watching. She was still by the window, always by the window. Like a statue the house was trying to forget. He didn't wave. He never had. Instead, he tapped a button on his desk, switching to a different feed, camera C6. Command Rampan began reviewing the rehearsal sequence once more. One mistake, he whispered. One flinch. That's all I need. The wind cut sharp across the training grounds, dry and bitter as it swept dust in tight spirals between the metal structures. Somewhere beyond the obstacle field, a bell rang not for mealtime or play, but for obedience trials. It was a sound that meant pain if you weren't fast enough. Shadow stood at the edge of the concrete yard, tethered by a short leash to a post driven deep into the ground. The coarse collar around his neck blinked red, the embedded trigger system waiting, always waiting. His ears twitched once, instinctively, as the heavy boots approached. Victor Brandt walked without a sound, not because he was graceful, but because control didn't need noise. He wore tactical gloves and mirrored sunglasses, though the morning sun had yet to rise over the outer fence. One hand held a clipboard. The other tapped the remote in his pocket, like a man petting a serpent he'd trained to strike. "Shadow," he barked, voice flat. The dog's body stiffened. His left hind leg shifted, slow and deliberate, trying not to show the tremor that never truly left him. The injury deep tissue, permanent nerve damage hadn't healed since that night in Helmand Province. But Victor didn't care. "Down." Shadow hesitated. A beat too long. The remote clicked. A violent jolt coursed through his neck and spine, short-circuiting nerves and memory alike. Shadow dropped hard, whimpering low in his throat before cutting himself off. He'd learned that whimpers made them angrier. "Faster next time," Victor said, scribbling something on his pad. "You're not in a hospital anymore. You're in my program now. In." But in that moment body tense, jaw-tight Shadow wasn't in the yard. He was back in Afghanistan. The desert was red that evening. Not from blood, though, that came later, but from the way the sun dipped low behind the ridge, casting everything in the same burnt hue as memory. Malik Reyes, his handler, had crouched beside him behind a Humvee, sweat pouring down his neck, one hand steady on Shadow's flank. "Easy, buddy," Malik whispered. "I got you." "Oh." Shadow's ears pricked forward, nose twitching. There was something off in the sand, a head no scent of oil. No buzz of wires but wrongness still radiated from that path. He looked up. Malik met his eyes. "You sure?" Shadow growled once, sharp and short. Malik didn't ask again. He signaled a halt. 10 seconds later, an explosion ripped the ground 6 feet to their right, an IED buried beneath a tire track. The blast was instant, deafening. The Humvee shielded most of the unit, but Malik had stepped forward to pull another soldier back and caught the shrapnel full to the chest. Shadow had lunged through the dust, muzzle bloodied, ears ringing. He found Malik's body, pulled at his vest, barked for help. But the man's eyes were already fading. His last breath smelled like copper and dirt. Shadow had stayed beside him until they forced him into the evac crate. They never let him see Malik again. Now, back in the yard, Shadow shook off the memory, like dust clinging to a wound. His breathing was shallow, controlled, almost human in its restraint. Victor clapped twice. "Up." Shadow rose slowly, his body favoring the bad leg. Not enough to show weakness, just enough to dull the pain. "Ramp." Victor pointed toward the slanted steel incline set up on the far side of the field. At the top, a dummy seated in a wheelchair, swaying gently in the wind, dressed in a child's hoodie. Shadow's ears twitched. His tail dropped low. "No delays," Victor warned. "You know the protocol." The shepherd started forward, one step, then another. His nails clicked softly on the cement, steady but reluctant. When he reached the base of the ramp, he paused, nostrils flaring, body locked. "Don't make me." He didn't move. The collar flashed red. Victor pressed the remote again. A sharp crackle surged through Shadow's neck. He stumbled sideways, nearly falling, catching himself just before he hit the ground. His breathing hitched. For a moment, he looked like he might collapse. But he didn't. He turned back to the ramp, eyes wide but dull, and took another step forward. "Good dog," Victor muttered. "Progress." But Shadow wasn't listening. Not to the orders barked. Not to the chaos unraveling around him like wires pulled from a detonated past. Not to Dorian's voice once, the law of his world now nothing more than static. Because Shadow was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere Keter. Not a physical place, but something carved into the soft undercurrent of his bones. A place he hadn't touched in years, not since the desert heat melted into gunfire and orders and cold metal floors. It was the memory of a hand calloused, warm resting just behind his ears, thumb brushing that spot where fur met skull. Gentle, reassuring, new commands, new conditions. Just that quiet whisper. "You're not just a weapon." The voice didn't belong to Dorian. It never had. It came from someone whose face was half-shadowed in his fragmented mind just. The edges remained. A pair of tired eyes, laughter tucked into the corner of a sun-chapped mouth, and the scent of dust and tobacco. Someone who had looked at him not with expectation, but with regard. The world around him blurred. The underground room with its fluorescent lights, the men shouting, the sound of Arden's breath catching as she stood between him and Danger, all dulled, like fog on the edges of a dream. And in the stillness, something flickered. Not anger, not blind obedience, not fear. Something older, deeper. Memory. It came not like a flood, but like a match in the dark. Small, hesitant, but impossible to ignore. A flicker of who he had once been beneath the conditioning, beneath the commands that shaped him into a creature designed to act, not feel. In that breathless second, Shadow didn't see Dorian. He saw a figure kneeling beside him, backlit by the setting sun of a place that no longer existed. A man with a crooked grin and a beat-up notebook. He remembered laying his head in that man's lap after a brutal training drill knot for reward. But because it felt safe. That man had once said, "You're more than they'll ever understand. But I do. I see you." Shadow blinked, and the memory vanished like sand through fingers. But its echo remained, and that echo was enough. Dorian's boot scraped forward, slow and calculated. His hand hovered near his belt, unsure. There was a shift in his posture, now barely perceptible to anyone else but Shadow saw it. The tension, the confusion, because for the first time, the dog wasn't responding the way he was trained to. He wasn't retreating. He wasn't attacking. He was simply there, still, steady, choosing. Arden, trembling, took a half-step closer. "Shadow," she whispered. No urgency, no command. Just his name like an offering. And that, too, unlocked something. He remembered her voice note just from tonight, but from all the nights before. Reading to him from books she never finished. Humming when she thought no one listened. Laughing, barely, as he clumsily tried to steal the peanut butter jar. Not a soldier's voice. A child's. Soft, cracked, healing. He turned his head toward her. Not fully. Just enough. Enough to say, "I know you." Enough to say, "You're real." And then slowly, deliberately, he stepped away from Dorian's line of command and placed himself squarely in front of Arden. Like a wall. No growl. No teeth. Just a silent, unmovable line between what was and what should never happen again. Dorian froze. His lips twitched. His eyes flicked to the observers above the glass wall. His power was slipping. Everyone saw it. Even the guards were shifting. Unsure whether they were watching a test or its collapse. "Shadow," Dorian said again, this time almost pleading. "Stand down." The dog didn't move. Didn't even blink. Behind him, Arden was crying now. Not sobbing. Just the soft, broken sounds of someone watching a miracle unfold and not knowing how to hold it. "You remember," she said. "You remember." Shadow didn't react outwardly, but something shifted in his chest. Something loosening, like shackles unfastening inside his ribs. The room around them remained frozen, officers, uncertain, monitors flickering, the air crackling with the kind of electricity that comes right before something breaks. And then someone shouted. Footsteps pounded. The door crashed open. Uniforms flooded in like a wave. Guns raised, then lowered just as fast. Voices overlapped. Target acquired. Suspect in sight. Hold fire. Dog is contained. But no one touched Shadow. They didn't have to. He was still standing guard, not against an enemy anymore, but for a girl who had once looked at him not with fear, but with faith. As the officers took Dorian to the ground, cuffs clanking, curses echoing through the room, Shadow remained where he was. Arden didn't run. She knelt, right there on the cold concrete, and as if pulled by gravity itself, Shadow finally moved. He lowered his head, just enough for her hand to find the top of his muzzle. Hiffing a tumble, but they landed, and he didn't flinch, didn't recoil. He leaned into it, a lifetime of harsh grips and sterile commands, undone by one small shaking hand that said, "You're allowed to feel." "You did it," she whispered. Shadow closed his eyes, not because of exhaustion, but because for the first time in years she could. The gravel path behind the east wing crunched softly under Arden's wheels as she moved alone, as slow, deliberate, as if her presence could disturb the air itself. The sun hadn't risen fully yet, but the sky was already turning the color of old apricots. There was no wind, no bird song, just silence and the muted squeak of rubber against stone. She wasn't supposed to be out here. The staff had their instructions. Arden was to remain inside the house. Too delicate, too fragile, too easily overlooked. But no one had seen her slip past the linen hallway, through the side patio door, and out toward the kennels. Balanced in her lap was a folded napkin. Inside, wrapped like something sacred, was half of a peanut butter sandwich. She'd asked the kitchen staff to cut the crusts off, said it was for herself. It wasn't The chain-link fences loomed ahead, cold, gray, and humming faintly from the morning dew. The kennels were lined like prison cells, uniform and clinical, with no names on the gates, just numbers. And inside the third pen on the left, lying motionless against the back wall, was the dog with the limp. Shadow. He wasn't asleep, Arden could tell. His ears flicked once, even though his eyes stayed closed. He was aware. But he didn't move a knot toward her, not away. She stopped about 5 feet from the gate, parking her wheelchair beside a slanted fence post where weeds had started to grow. From this angle, she could see the curl of his paw, the stiff arch in his back, the collar's faint red glow. Her heart beat louder than the wheels had. She didn't speak, not yet. Instead, with a small exhale, she reached into her lap, unfolded the napkin with trembling fingers, and carefully tore the sandwich in two. One half she placed back in the cloth. The other, just a palm-sized piece of soft bread and peanut butter, she rolled gently in her hand until it warmed, then leaned forward as far as her balance allowed, and slid it through the lowest corner of the fence. It landed softly in the dirt, not 2 feet from Shadow's nose. Then she rolled back and waited. No words, no coaxing, just her presence and the quiet offering between them. For a long time, nothing happened. Shadow didn't move. His body remained rigid, as though frozen in the shadow of something larger, something older than training, deeper than fear. But his nose twitched once. Then again, the scent of peanut butter traveled slowly, like a memory. He opened his eyes. They were darker than she expected. Not harsh, not aggressive, just tired, ancient almost, like he'd lived through something no one had asked him to survive. He saw her, and she saw him. Still, he didn't move. Not until her wheelchair gave a faint creak as she shifted in her seat. That was when he lifted his head, ever so slightly. His eyes darted to the sandwich, then back to her. Back and forth, as if expecting a trap. His body tensed, like a soldier scanning a minefield, nose reaching first, then one paw creeping forward, slow and deliberate. He stopped once, uncertain. Arden didn't blink. The peanut butter was close now, close enough that a breath could carry the scent to the back of his throat. His ears flattened. He looked again at her, longer this time, like he was searching for something. Permission. Maybe. Or peace. And then, finally, he took it, mouth low to the ground, teeth barely opening, just enough to scoop the soft bread between his jaws. He didn't gulp it. He didn't snatch. He ate it slow, and Arden smiled, just a little. A smile so small it didn't reach her lips, but it lived behind her eyes. Shadow's tail didn't wag, but it didn't tuck either. He sat upright now, watching her, studying, not as a threat, not even as a trainer, as something else entirely. Arden glanced at the other half of the sandwich in her lap. She wanted to say something. "I'll come back tomorrow, maybe." Or, "Thank you for not being afraid." But the words stayed inside. She didn't need them. Instead, she reached up and gently touched the heart-shaped pendant that hung around her neck. Her thumb rubbed it, slowly, like a rhythm. Then she turned the wheelchair around and rolled back the way she came. Behind her, Shadow remained seated, ears forward, gaze locked. And in the dirt between them, the crumbs were gone. The morning light poured in through the lace-curtained windows of the parlor, casting delicate shadows across the polished floor, like things trying to hide in plain sight. Elena stood in front of the sink, staring at her reflection in the kitchen window, hands wet but unmoving. The coffee had gone cold in the pot. She hadn't slept well, not in weeks. Something had shifted in the house. The walls felt tighter, the silence heavier, and Dorian, her husband, had begun making phone calls behind locked doors again. She heard them sometimes, late at night, his voice low but sharp. Words like demonstration, optical leverage, clean sequence. Words that didn't belong in a home with a child. Elena turned away from the sink, drying her hands on a towel that still smelled faintly of lavender. Arden's breakfast tray sat untouched on the counter. A cup of warm milk, half a banana. She sighed and picked it up. As she stepped into the hallway, the sound of small wheels reached her. "Arden?" she called softly. But the sound was moving away, not toward her. By the time she turned the corner, her daughter was already gone, slipped past the watchful eyes of the house, again. Elena moved faster than usual, her bare feet quiet on the wooden floor. She opened the side door to the yard and caught sight of a small figure in the distance, retreating from the direction of the kennels. Her breath caught. Later, after coaxing Arden into finishing part of her breakfast, Elena found herself alone again. She wandered toward the training grounds, not something she did often. The air there always felt wrong, like the scent of fear had soaked into the soil and never washed out. She kept her distance from the chain-link fences, but her eyes scanned the kennels until they found Shadow. He was lying in the far corner, half in shadow, half in sunlight. His fur looked matted near the ribs. Dirt clung to one side of his flank. And there when he shifted was a bruise. Elena froze. The discoloration wasn't natural. It was faint, but visibly a patch of skin just beneath the short fur, darkened, swollen. Shadow tried to rise when he noticed her, but winced. His back leg faltered. A sharp tug twisted in her stomach. She stepped closer, cautiously, her fingers clutching the folds of her sweater. "Who did that to you?" she whispered. Of course, he didn't answer, but he looked at her, really looked. And for the briefest moment, she felt like she was staring at someone who had once been noble, honored, broken now, but not by nature, by hands. Elena returned to the house, face tight, heart pounding. That evening, as the wind pressed soft fingers against the window panes, she knelt beside Arden's bed, tucking the covers under her legs with care. The room smelled of crayons and old books' childhood, fighting to stay alive inside a house built on quiet threats. "Did you go out this morning?" Elena asked gently. Arden hesitated, then nodded once. "To the kennels?" Another nod. No apology, just honesty. Elena sighed and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek. "Sweetheart, I know you feel safe with him, that dog, but you must not go near those pens anymore." Arden's eyes searched hers, wide and unblinking. Not angry, not scared, just still. "Why?" she asked, barely audible. Elena hesitated. "Because I think someone's hurting him," she said. "And I don't know how far they'll go." Arden blinked, her lip twitching as if to speak, but nothing came. She simply turned her head toward the window, where the last bit of daylight bled into gold. "You're not in trouble," Elena added. "I'm just trying to keep you safe." Still no answer. But as Elena reached to turn off the lamp, she caught sight of something half hidden beneath Arden's sketchbook. A folded napkin. Inside, the faintest smear of peanut butter. Elena's heart sank equal. Parts, grief, and something else she couldn't name. She turned out the light and stood there for a moment longer, watching the outline of her daughter's profile against the pale curtain behind her. "What have you found out there that I can't protect you from?" she wondered. "And what happens when Dorian finds it too?" Outside, a single dog barked once, then silence. The days settled into a rhythm no one else noticed. Each morning, after the house stirred and then stilled, Arden would wheel herself quietly out the side entrance between the hydrangeas that no longer bloomed and under the bent archway that led toward the kennels. No one followed her. No one questioned the absence of a little girl too quiet to be missed. But someone waited for her. Shadow had started rising before she arrived. At first, it had just been a flick of the ear, then a shift in posture. But now, he sat up fully when he sensed her coming, his body stiff with effort, as if standing too fast might reveal how much pain still lived in his bones. His tail didn't wag in the way of house dogs, but it twitched once, just once, like a breath being held and slowly let go. Arden never brought more than a folded napkin. Sometimes it was a crust of bread or the corner of an apple slice. But more often, it was nothing she could feed him. Just words, kept small and soft, delivered in pieces like breadcrumbs trailing from the quiet place inside her heart. She never raised her voice. Not once. Instead, she sat beside the third kennel, her wheels angled slightly toward the fence so she wouldn't have to strain her neck to see him. One hand rested on her lap. The other held her sketchbook, open to a fresh page every day. And she'd talk. "I don't like stairs," she said once, almost conversationally. "Not because I can't use them, but because they always make people look at me funny." Shadow blinked slowly. "They don't say anything, but I can feel the difference, you know?" The dog didn't move, except for the subtle twitch of an ear. "When I was 3, I used to run so fast, my mom said I was a blur." Arden paused. "Now, I just roll quiet like a shadow, kind of like you." She smiled at the word shadow, realizing only then how fitting it was. He didn't come close, never barked, never begged. But the space between them was shrinking in a way only two broken things could understand. Not with movement, but with presence. On the 4th day, as the afternoon sun poured like liquid gold over the metal fencing, Arden set down her pencil and stared at the drawing in her lap. It wasn't perfect. His proportions were offers too large, eyes too soft, but she liked it anyway. Shadow. Not snarling, not standing, just being. Head slightly tilted. Like now. She held the sketch up through the fence, just high enough for him to see it. "It's you," she whispered. "Kind of. I'm not very good yet, but I'll keep trying." Shadow sniffed the air, eyes flicking between the paper and her face. Then she did something she hadn't done before. Arden reached out and laid the sketch down just beneath the lowest rail of the chain-link gate. She didn't slide it inside, only left it there, a gift without obligation. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at him not as a pet, not as a threat, but as something in between. A mirror, maybe. "You don't need to come close," she said softly. "I just want you to know someone sees you." The wind picked up then, rustling the tall grass behind them. It wasn't harsh, just enough to stir the evening stillness, enough to lift a few brittle leaves into the air and send them dancing across the gravel path. Shadow didn't flinch. Where once he would have tensed, crouched low to the ground, bracing for the unknown this time, he simply watched, calm, steady. His ears twitched at the wind, but his eyes remained locked on one thing. Her. Arden stood a few paces away, her back to him now. The light from the porch behind her cast a warm glow across her shoulders, outlining her like something belonging to both day and night. She paused, her breath fogging gently in the cooling air, then glanced back over her shoulder. Their eyes met. No leash, no command, no sound at all passed between them. And still, he stayed. She smiled, small but real. A quiet gratitude passed across her face, like someone recognizing a miracle in real time. Then, without another word, she turned again and began walking toward the house. And for the first time since he'd arrived at Hollow Grove, he didn't lie back down the moment she left his sight. Shadow remained sitting, upright, motionless, save for the wind tugging lightly at his fur. Even after she disappeared behind the porch door, even after the last click of the lock sounded in the dark, he kept his gaze fixed in the direction she had gone, as if to say, "I'm still here." As if to say, "I'll wait." The night stretched out around him, cool and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a barn owl called once. A screen door creaked shut in another part of the property. And still Shadow didn't move. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't vigilance born of training. It was something deeper. It was choice. He chose to stay awake, to stand watch, not out of duty, but devotion. To anchor himself in the place where safety had once been unfamiliar but no longer was. The ground beneath him had held fear before. Now it held memory. Of peanut butter on trembling palms. Of laughter rising in the kitchen. Of a girl's voice cracking through silence with a single whispered word. Stay. And so, he did. When Arden reached her bedroom, the world had quieted to a hush, so complete it almost felt sacred. Her fingers brushed the edge of the curtain as she moved it aside. The glass pane was cool beneath her touch, smooth as still water. Outside, the porch light cast a faint amber glow across the yard. The wind had calmed, leaving the trees swaying just barely, like they were breathing in their sleep. And there was Shadow, a silhouette carved against the night. He wasn't lying down. He wasn't curled beneath the stairs or nestled against the railing like he sometimes was during storms. Number. He was sitting upright, ears forward, tail wrapped calmly around his side. And though the distance blurred his eyes from view, Arden knew somehow, without question, that he was facing her. Facing this window. Her breath caught, just a little. She didn't move right away, didn't tap the glass or call out or reach to open it. That wasn't what this was. This wasn't a moment of needing attention. This was a moment of knowing. She raised her hand slowly and pressed her palm flat to the window pane. Not as a signal, not as a command, but as a recognition and answer to something that had never been said out loud, yet was always understood. I see you. I feel you. He didn't budge, didn't shift or tilt his head like he often did when he was curious or alert. He simply stayed, still, watchful, present. But he wasn't guarding the house. He wasn't scanning for threats or checking perimeter lines. He was with her, in spirit, in loyalty. In that quiet, ancient language that has no words-only glances, silences, and the way two beings can carry each other without speaking. That night, Arden didn't feel like a girl who had been broken and patched together with therapy sessions and whispered reassurances. She didn't feel like a case file or a recovery statistic. She felt seen, not by the world, not even by the people who loved her, but by the creature who had lived through the same fire and still chose to sit outside her window like he'd never left. A dog once trained to obey orders, stripped of choice, robbed of warmth, had chosen this. Her, the girl who used to sit on this very floor, knees to her chest, believing she was invisible to everyone and everything, now stood tall, hand to the glass, heart beating in sync with the silent sentinel below. And in that stillness, something settled in her chest. Shadow wasn't just a survivor. He wasn't just a rescue or a cautionary tale about what cruelty can do to a noble creature. He wasn't the sum of his scars. Tonight, in this sliver of time carved between darkness and dawn, he became something else entirely. He became her shadow, not because he followed her, not because he needed protection, and not because of training drilled into bone and sinew, but because he had chosen to stay, to remain in her orbit, not out of instinct, but out of recognition, out of love, out of something older than both of them. Arden sank down to the floor, legs folding beneath her. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, but her eyes stayed on him, his form bathed in porchlight and silence. She didn't need to cry. She didn't feel sadness. What filled her instead was something softer, deeper. Gratitude. Not the polite kind. Not the kind you say because someone hands you a warm plate or holds the door. But the kind that forms when someone sees the deepest part of you, the part you don't talk about, the part that aches when it rains or when a song plays that reminds you of things you've buried and chooses to stay anyway. That's what Shadow had done. He had seen her fear, her quietness, her days of doubt, and he had stayed, not just in the house, but in her rhythm, in her space, in her story. He had become the echo of something lost and the promise of something still being written. Downstairs, Arden could hear the soft murmur of her mother's voice, maybe speaking to Micah as she helped him settle into his room. A chair scraped gently against tile, then quiet again. A home at peace, a home in healing. Arden looked back out the window. Shadow hadn't moved. The wind stirred again, ruffling the trees just enough to send leaves scattering along the sidewalk. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. A part of her wondered how long he'd stay like that. But maybe the question didn't matter. Maybe the miracle wasn't that he was still there tonight. Maybe it was that he could be. That after all the cages, all the orders, all the cold concrete of military pens and underground cells, he could sit beneath her window on a quiet night and simply exist. Be choice. Arden reached over to her nightstand and pulled her sketchbook into her lap. Her hands moved instinctively, charcoal dust catching under her nails as she outlined what she saw. Not just the shape of a dog, but the posture of loyalty, the stillness of presence, the miracle of return. She shaded in the light beneath him, the glow from the porch stretching across the wood, and then softened the space around him with whispers of gray like the night was gently holding him too. And as she finished, she added one last line beneath the drawing. Not a caption, not a title, just 4 words she hadn't dared to say before. He chose to stay. Then she set the sketchbook down. The clock on her dresser ticked softly. Outside, the world turned slowly forward toward morning. But for now, in this house of second chances, in this room filled with sketches and silence, Arden allowed herself to believe something she had never quite believed before. That love can return. That some shadows don't follow you because of fear, but because they've found home in your light. The morning haze hadn't lifted, and already the heat rising off the training field smelled like steel and sweat. In the operations Sheeta concrete box disguised as an equipment room, Dorian Hale stood over a long metal table, running his fingers across the matte black casing of a rectangular remote. It looked unremarkable, like something used to open a garage or start a car from a distance. But its antenna and blinking red light betrayed its real function. Command override. The remote was linked to a collarone that currently circled Shadow's thick neck like a chain forged not of metal, but of betrayal. "Show me," Dorian said curtly. Victor, already waiting, pulled a tablet from the shelf and tapped the screen. A small display lit up. Real-time data. Heart rate. Stimulation levels. Distance from command base. Status. Armed. The collar uses a modified shock and vibrational feedback system, Victor began. His voice was flat, technical, like he was reading from a weapons manual. 3 stages of control. Level 1 auditory cue. 2 pulse vibration. 3 shock. Dorian didn't look up. What about the new pairing trigger? We've integrated movement-based coding. Motion sensors on the collar are linked to visual pattern recognition. We've hard-coded a profile that tracks wheel-like motion at a child's height. Oh. He paused, almost imperceptibly. She's the only one on the estate that fits the parameters. Dorian's lips thinned. Excellent. Victor tapped the tablet again and brought up a video from yesterday's test run. On screen, a practice dummy in a motorized wheelchair was rolled across the training yard. Shadow's eyes tracked it. His ears pinned back. When Victor pressed the remote, the collar buzzed. Shadow snarled, lunged but stopped, inches short. Confused, not fully committed. "He's still hesitating," Victor said. "He doesn't understand why the motion equals threat." "Then make him understand," Dorian snapped. "You have 4 days. The demonstration can't be soft. It needs to be clean, controlled, powerful." Victor narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly do you want the audience to see?" Dorian finally looked up. His gaze was calm, calculated. "I want them to see a creature once deemed unmanageable," he said, voice low. "Reprogrammed to respond with surgical precision. Not emotion, not instinct, just obedience." He walked slowly to the window, which overlooked the lower portion of the grounds. From there, he could see the training ringware. Right now, Shadow sat under a shaded enclosure, flanked by 2 metal barriers and a training dummy slouched in a wheelchair. The sun glinted off the back of Shadow's collar. The blinking red light pulsed steadily, like a second heartbeat. Not his. Dorian folded his arms. "I want the investors to believe we can turn fear into function, that we can erase what came before. Soldier, trauma, loyalty, gone. What's left? Utility." "And Arden?" Victor asked again, more cautious this time. Dorian didn't hesitate. "She'll be nearby, as planned. She's just a child." "No," Dorian replied coolly. "She's an obstacle, an emotional liability tied to a fortune I intend to reclaim. Her presence will trigger the dog. The reaction will appear spontaneous. The containment team will intervene. Publicly, it's an accident. Privately, it's removal." Victor's jaw flexed. For the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes. Not guilt, perhaps, but the shadow of a question he didn't dare speak. "Keep your hesitation out of the training yard," Dorian warned, voice sharp. "If this works, we sign a dozen more contracts by summer. Military, security firms, corrections. You think this is about one dog? It's about a program." Victor gave a stiff nod and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, Dorian called out, "Softer now. And Victor, make sure she's close enough. We don't get a second chance. Victor paused. I understand. The door closed behind him. Down in the yard, Shadow raised his head, ears flicking toward the sound of metal on gravel. The wheelchair dummy rolled forward again, pushed by a silent assistant. The collar buzzed, and once more, the war that Shadow thought he'd left behind returned. The house was different at night. By day, the Hale estate pretended to be a sanctuary of neatly trimmed hedges, rosewood railings, and white stone paths that glowed warm in the morning light. But once the sun dipped behind the hills and the shadows returned, everything sharpened. The stillness wasn't peace. It was warning. Elena moved quietly through the hallway, barefoot on tile, careful not to let the boards creak. She held a folded towel in one hand, but it was only camouflage something to make her presence in the corridor seem accidental if anyone asked. She'd heard something, a voice, low, intentional. Dorian's. She paused near the study door, just past the grand staircase where dust had begun to settle along the banister places the staff never cleaned because Dorian never noticed. From inside, his voice came again, quieter this time. The optics have to be perfect, nothing messy. A pause. Then, I don't care if it looks too clean. That's the point. Clean execution. Emotional impact without liability. Elena leaned closer, heart thudding. A second voice replied distorted, mechanical, on speakerphone. She couldn't catch all the words, just phrases that caught like barbs in her chest. Child in frame. The dog reacts. Media loves heroes and tragedy. Elena's grip on the towel tightened. She's just a symbol. No next of kin worth anything. You said that yourself. There was silence for a moment. Then the unmistakable clink of glass, as if Dorian were swirling something in a tumbler, relaxed in a way that meant he thought no one was listening. Then came the last Lynn delivered, with an ease that made her stomach drop. Afterward, we retire the asset. Quietly. No press. Just another failed prototype. He was talking about Shadow. And the child. There was only one that fit both categories. Elena backed away, careful not to breathe too loudly. She turned quickly and made her way down the hall, chest tight, eyes burning. In the kitchen, the lights were dim. She leaned on the counter for a moment, trying to slow her thoughts. The edges of her world had begun to blur fear, disbelief, and something darker whispering through her mind. He's going to hurt her, and he's going to use the dog to do it. Footsteps behind her made her jolt. Mrs. Hale? She turned sharply, heart still racing. Luis, the stable hand, stood awkwardly near the back doorway. Barely 22, soft-spoken, with dark curls tucked under a baseball cap that never seemed to sit right. He held a flashlight in one hand and a wrench in the other, eyes wide with concern. Sorry, I didn't mean to sneak up on you, he said quickly. I saw you walk in and thought something was wrong. Elena tried to compose herself. It's nothing. I couldn't sleep. Luis hesitated, shifting his weight. Then he looked over his shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one was around. When he looked back, his voice dropped to a whisper. I think something's happening with the dog, he said. Her chest tightened again. What do you mean? I was fixing the back generator near the sheds earlier, around dusk. I heard Mr. Hale and Victor talking. They were too close not to hear me if I moved, so I stayed hidden. Elena stared at him, heart sinking deeper with every word. They said something about a demonstration, Luis continued. That it had to be believable. That the girl, he paused, your daughter had to be nearby when it happened. Elena went cold. They're using him, Luis said. Shadow. I think they're making him go after anything with wheels. They've been rolling a dummy through the training yard for days now. And today, he didn't hesitate. She swallowed hard, fingers gripping the edge of the countertop like it was the only thing anchoring her. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Luis looked confused, almost offended. Because it's wrong, he said. And because she's just a kid. The kitchen went silent for a long breath. Then Elena moved to the drawer by the fridge and pulled out a small silver keyone Dorian hadn't touched in years. She handed it to him. Go to my study. Lock the door behind you. There's a black recorder in the top drawer. Start documenting everything. Audio, video, names. I'll keep Arden safe, but if anything happens to me... She didn't finish the sentence. Luis nodded, suddenly older in the way he stood. As he slipped out into the darkness, Elena turned toward the hallway where her daughter was sleeping, unaware that the world outside her room was starting to fracture. Somewhere out in the yard, a dog lifted his head and stared toward the house ears, alert, body still. The storm was coming. The morning began with dust and steel. Out in the main yard of Hale Military Canine Training Grounds, the air was already thick with the scent of sweat, gun oil, and scorched rubber from the tracked decoy carts. Victor preferred his mornings. Loud commands barked, collars buzzing, dogs snapping into motion like springs pulled too tight. But Shadow was slower today. Not physically, his frame still surged forward when the metal gates clicked open, but there was something else. Something small, subtle. A hesitation. It happened at the first pivot. The wheelchair decoy rolled past him, and Victor gave the signal-sharp whistle. Then a barked code word, "Engage." Shadow launched. But not like before, not with the full drive of muscle and mission. At the last second, no more than a heartbeat's ears dipped. His stride shortened. His teeth never met the padding of the decoy. He veered slightly, claws scraping asphalt, and instead of clamping down on the armrest as programmed, he let the dummy pass. Just a breath of resistance. But Victor saw it. The man stormed across the field, boots pounding the ground like gunshots. His hand went to the remote, thumb pressing hard. A sharp, high-pitched whine escaped Shadow's throat as the collar fired electric pain threading down his spine. He staggered, legs trembling, breath stuttering in his chest. But he didn't fall, and more importantly, he didn't look at Victor. Instead, his eyes flicked toward the window, the same window he had seen the girl behind day after day. Arden. Victor followed the glance, lips tightening into a thin sneer. "Don't go soft now," he hissed. "You're not a pet. You're a weapon." Shadow didn't respond, just stood there, chest rising and falling in slow defiance, ears flat. The collar left a faint singe mark beneath his fur. But he didn't move, and he didn't bite. Victor walked away eventually, muttering into his radio, promising to recalibrate the trigger profiles. But the cameras had seen it. The hesitation, the falter, that would be noted, logged, and punished. That night, the air shifted. Rain tapped gently against the kennels, not enough to soak, just enough to whisper. The overhead lights buzzed weakly, casting long shadows across the gravel path between rows of cages. Inside Kennel 9, Shadow lay curled against the back wall. His body coiled tight, tail tucked beneath him, like he was trying to vanish into himself. His water bowl sat untouched. Dinner, too. But his eyes were open, watching the window. The same window where Arden had once appeared, wrapped in a blanket, face half lit by moonlight. She hadn't come today. Not in the morning, not at dusk. The stone path had remained empty. Her wheelchair's hum never broke the silence. Still, he watched, as if some part of him still expected her to be there, as if some part of him still hoped she would appear, and that familiar weight, neither command nor threat, would settle into his chest again. Hope. It was a foreign thing, a dangerous thing. But tonight, it wrapped around him like warmth. He shifted his weight and let out a low sigh, half growl, half grief. No chains tugged his neck. No orders barked in his ear. Just the soft, aching quiet of choice. He turned his head slightly, resting his chin near the bars, where the breeze sometimes slipped through like a whisper. Tonight, the wind carried something faint but familiar. The smell of peanut butter, just a trace of it, barely there but enough. Enough to open a door in his mind. Enough to make the walls inside him tremble. It wasn't the sharp kind of memory, not the ones trained in through repetition and consequence. It was softer, older, a fragment. A paw pressed gently against a hand smeared with peanut butter. A laugh young, light, real, not a command barked, not a buzzer, just a child's laugh. He didn't know whose or when, but it had existed. And that alone was enough to confuse the scars etched deep into his psyche. The scent was fleeting, the memory even more so, but it had cracked something. And in that sliver of quiet that followed, the ache inside him wasn't sharp or bitter. It was heavy, human. He didn't know how long he stayed like that, chin resting low, listening to nothing but the hum of distant crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Somewhere in the building, a door clicked shut. Footsteps echoed down a hallway, The metallic scent of oil and old discipline lingered in the vents, but he didn't flinch, didn't move. Because his thoughts weren't trapped inside these walls tonight. They were with her. Arden. She had never raised her voice, never yanked a leash or snapped a command expecting robotic obedience. She didn't treat him like a broken machine or a science project to be monitored. She treated him like a being, not an assignment, not a problem to solve. She had just seen him, not the uniform number burned into his collar, not the checklist of behaviors or the catalog of damage logged by the handlers before her. She saw the way his ears lowered slightly when someone laughed too loudly, the way he never turned his back to a door, the way he paused every single time before eating as if waiting for permission he no longer believed he deserved. She noticed it all, and instead of trying to fix him, she sat with it, with him, and in doing so, gave him the one thing no one else ever had. Time. Time to unlearn. Time to breathe without purpose. Time to exist outside of the binary of threat and obedience. He didn't understand it at first. He had been conditioned too deeply, for too long. But over the week, slowly, imperceptibly, something shifted. It started with the way she would sit on the floor across from him, not looking at him, but simply sharing space. Then it was the gentle way she set his food down and stepped back, not as a show of dominance, but respect. And then, one day, the peanut butter, not smeared on a training tool or laced into a command sequence. Just a spoon, offered without expectation. And her voice, soft, curious. You can say no. And he hadn't known what to do with that. He could say no. No one had told him that before. He hadn't taken it that day. But he hadn't turned away either. That moment had stayed with him, like a seed buried in the dark. Tonight, the scent had brought it back. And now, here he was, lying in the quiet, chin by the bars, remembering something that wasn't pain. There was a word. Arden Eustace heard it through the crack under her door when she spoke to others. Shadow. He didn't know that it was a name, or that it had become his name. But somehow, it fit. Not because he followed her like an echo, but because he had become a part of the quiet between her footsteps. He was her shadow, the way old wounds leave impressions long after healing. The way light doesn't erase darkness, it just reshapes it. She hadn't forced it. She hadn't reached for control. She had waited. And that wait, that stillness, had done more than years of programming ever could. It had allowed him to see himself not as the sum of damage, but as a dog, a living creature, with wants, with instincts, with a soul. He blinked slowly. His eyes felt dry from staring too long. But he didn't shift. He stayed there, nose tilted slightly toward the wind, as if hoping it would carry more fragments, more pieces of whatever life he'd left behind, before the drills, before the guns, before the name was erased. His paws twitched, not from a dream, but from something closer to longing. Longing for that floor where she sat cross-legged, sketching in silence. Longing for the scratch behind the ear she once gave him when she thought he was asleep. Longing for the way she whispered, "You're not just a weapon," like it wasn't a hope, but a truth she'd already accepted. That phrase had carved itself into something deeper than memory. It had settled in the cracks, in the parts of him that still bled, even when no one could see. He didn't understand words the way humans did, but he understood tone and truth, and hers was the first that hadn't felt like a trick, the first that didn't lead to pain. Somewhere above him, a light clicked off, probably her room, the window that overlooked the backyard, the same one he always drifted toward, even when confined, because even if he couldn't reach her, he could stay near the sound of her breath against the glass, because even if she never said another word, he had heard what mattered. She saw him, and for a creature built to follow orders, that had been the most radical act of all. Recognition, acceptance, not of what he could do but of who he was. And in that simple act, she had given him something he didn't know he could still want. Not freedom, but choice. To move when he was ready. To lie down without fear. To stay. Or maybe, one day, to follow. But only because he wanted to. Not because someone had commanded him. Tonight, He didn't sleep. He lay awake in the silence, eyes half closed, chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. Outside the bars, the night wrapped around the building like a blanket. Inside, something broken was quietly, miraculously learning how to breathe again. Not as a ghost, not as a tool, but as a dog. And maybe, just maybe as something more. It was past midnight when Luis knocked on the side entrance of the manor. 3 soft taps, then one more hesitant, the kind of knock that carried more fear than force. Elena opened the door herself. She didn't speak at first, just stared at him, the wind rustling her loose cardigan, casting her silhouette long across the tiled hallway. Her hand tightened on the edge of the door. Luis looked down at his boots. He hadn't even wiped them. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he whispered, not meeting her eyes. "I shouldn't be here like this. But I didn't know who else." "Come in," Elena said, voice low, quickly. She closed the door behind him and led him into the small back sitting room, the one with the lamp that flickered and smelled faintly of cinnamon from Arden's diffuser. The girl was asleep upstairs. Or at least, she hoped she was. Luis sat on the edge of the armchair, hands clenched tight between his knees. He was barely 20. His work boots were too big, and his conscience even bigger. She'd always noticed that. "Do think something bad is going to happen," he blurted, barely waiting for her to sit. Elena didn't flinch, just nodded. "Tell me." Luis licked his lips. "I was clearing out the hay bales behind the north stables 2 nights ago. It was late. I heard Mr. Hale and Victor talking by the kennel doors. They didn't see me. I swear I wasn't eavesdropping, just, moving slow." He paused, swallowed. They were talking about Shadow, something about a trigger, a collar, how they'd calibrated it to go off during the demo. Elena's heart thudded, but she didn't interrupt, just leaned in slightly. "They said it had to be clean," Luis continued, "that the optics would be powerful if the dog snapped mid-display. I didn't get it at first, thought it was just part of the training. But then," he finally looked up, "they said the trigger would be her wheelchair." The words dropped like stone into water. Ripples of disbelief, of recognition. Elena's breath hitched, but she didn't let it show. Her spine straightened. "They're going to test the dog's aggression in Arden," she said quietly. Luis's eyes filled. "I think they're trying to prove something to the buyers about how far they can push conditioning. Like, look what we can make a dog do. Even to a child it knows." He looked sick saying it, and Elena felt sick hearing it. "She's just a little girl," he said. "She doesn't even speak that much. She just sits by the kennels sometimes. The dog likes her. I've seen it. But they don't care." The room was so quiet now that the hum of the refrigerator down the hall sounded like thunder. Elena stood, walked to the window, and pressed her fingers against the cool glass. Outside, the fog crept over the yard, wrapping around the structures like a secret. "When is it happening?" she asked. "Tomorrow. Noon. The big display in front of the donors." Elena closed her eyes for a moment. Her thoughts moved fast, but her voice remained calm. "You can't say anything," she said. "Not to the other staff. Not to anyone." Luis nodded, already trembling. "I won't. I swear it." "But you can help me," she continued, quietly. He sat up straighter. "I need proof. Anything video, voice recording, collar settings, get it. Don't let them see you. If you're caught, say nothing. I'll protect Arden. You protect the truth." Luis's hands were shaking now, but his nod was firm. "Yes, ma'am." Elena reached over and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're brave, Luis," she whispered. "And I don't forget brave." He looked like he might cry, but he didn't. Just pulled his hood up and slipped out into the night, disappearing into the fog like a boy much older than he should have had to become. The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky was holding its breath. Out past the paddocks, wind rolled through the trees like a warning. The clouds swirled low and sullen, pulling a shadow over the ranch that seemed to come from more than just the weather. In her bedroom, Arden sat cross-legged on her bed, a spiral sketchbook balanced against the armrest of her wheelchair. Pencils were scattered across the quilt, like soldiers in Retrithalf used, dulled down, their colors smudged across her palms. She'd been working on this drawing all afternoon. It wasn't the shadow everyone else saw. Not the snarling, lunging, steel-collared weapon paraded around the training grounds like a loaded gun. Not the asset Dorian bragged about to his partners. Notha's shadow was curled beneath a moonlit window, back to the world, eyes half closed in a kind of surrender. His ears were tilted not in fear, but listening, quiet, not fierce. She'd shaded his fur soft, the lines around his muzzle worn but careful. There was no tension in his mouth, only fatigue, and something like hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was him. Arden tore the page from the coil, folded it in thirds with shaking fingers, and slid it gently into the side pouch of her wheelchair. Her hand lingered there for a second, brushing the soft canvas as if to say, "I see you, even if no one else does." Downstairs, she could hear her mother in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes trying too hard to sound normal. Arden wheeled herself down slowly, her thoughts louder than her wheels. When she reached the bottom step, Elena turned startled for just a second. Her eyes were glassy, like she'd just finished wiping something away, or trying not to. "Hey, sweetheart," she said too quickly. "I was just making some tea." Arden looked up at her. There was something steady in her face today, like she had already made up her mind about something heavy. "Do you think a dog can be taught to be bad?" Arden asked quietly. Elena froze mid-stir, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. "I think a dog can be hurt into doing things that aren't right," she said after a pause. "Just like people." Arden nodded once. "Because he's not bad," she whispered. "Shadow, he's just broken, like me." Elena turned fully now, and for a moment the kitchen wasn't a kitchen, it was a shelter. One holding two beings who'd been shaped by things they never asked for. "You are not broken, Arden," Elena said softly. Arden didn't argue. She just rolled closer and reached for her mother's hand. "Neither is he." The words were small, but they filled the room. Outside, a gust of wind slammed the porch swing into the railing. Thunder cracked faintly in the distance, low and rolling, like something ancient clearing its throat. The horses in the far barn started pacing. Even the dogs in the kennels far off behind the estate let out a few unsettled barks. "Is storm coming?" Elena kneeled next to Arden's chair and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "If I asked you not to go near the kennels tomorrow, would you listen?" Arden looked down. "I already promised him I'd come." Elena closed her eyes, just for a second. The kind of silence that parents learn to sit with when they know they can't protect everything. "I need you to trust me," Elena said gently. "Just for tomorrow. Stay close to me." The plea wasn't desperate. It was careful, heavy with what she couldn't say. Arden hesitated, but then nodded. Just then, the sky opened. Rain smacked the windows like 1,000 tapping fingers. The porch swing creaked louder, and a chill rushed under the doorframe. Elena stood and walked over to the window. Through the glass, the storm painted the world in gray streaks and blurry outlines. For a moment, the kennel yard was visible beyond the rise of the hill, and though she couldn't see him from here, Elena knew Shadow would be curled in his corner, ears flicking at the thunder, eyes fixed on the gap in the door where Arden used to sit, both of them waiting for something that hadn't been promised, something like a chance. The room was small, windowless, and cold in that manufactured way where concrete and silence fused together and soaked into your skin. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A single bulb flickered every few seconds like a nervous tick. Shadow stood in the center of the room, tethered loosely to a steel anchor bolted into the floor. His chest rose and fell, steady but guarded. Muscles taut beneath fur matted with dried sweat. The tactical collar wrapped snug around his neck, silent, gleaming under the light like a cuff on a prisoner. Victor stood across from him, expression blank but eyes calculating. One thumb hovered just above the remote trigger in his hand. "Last test," he muttered. He pressed the button. A high-frequency buzz, sharp and immediate, crackled through the collar. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a scream only Shadow could hear. The dog jolted. His lips peeled back in a snarl before he could stop, teeth bared, ears flattening. His body reacted the way it had been conditioned to, through pain and repetition, but his paws didn't move. He didn't lunge, didn't beat just stood there wivering, shoulders braced, growl trapped in his throat like a memory too old to unlearn. Victor narrowed his eyes. That hesitation wasn't there last week. He pressed the trigger again, Buzz. This time Shadow merely winced. No snarl, no flinch. His eyes, those storm-colored eyes, locked onto Victor's with something that wasn't fear. Not exactly defiance. Something older. Something tired. The door opened behind them. Dorian stepped in, crisp suit as always, hair neat, the kind of man who wore control like cologne. He glanced briefly at the dog, then to Victor's hand. "Problem?" he asked, tone light but laced with warning. "He's resisting," Victor said. "I think the girl's visits are interfering. Conditioning's eroding." Dorian stepped forward, examining Shadow as if he were inspecting a piece of tech, not a living creature. His voice dropped, measured. "It doesn't matter. It just needs to work once." Victor folded his arms. "You're sure she'll scream?" "Oh, she'll scream." Dorian smiled, hinting cruel. "We put her exactly where we need her. Front row. No barrier. Everyone watching." He looked down at the collar's transmitter. The indicator light blinked a slow red. Still synced. "If the collar triggers," Dorian continued, "he lashes out. We say it was a freak reaction. Too unstable. Trauma from combat. Tragic. Unpredictable. The girl gets scratched. Nothing fatal. But loud enough. Scary enough. Cameras catch it. Press eats it alive. And the rehabilitation program gets buried. For good." Victor was silent for a long moment, then asked, almost curious, "And the dog?" Dorian's smile vanished. "He's put down by nightfall. A beat. No autopsy. No fallout. No memory." He paused by the door, adjusting his cufflink. "This must look like an accident," he repeated. "The girl screams. The dog's put down. We all win." Victor didn't answer. He looked back at Shadow still, frozen, still watching. That same unreadable look in his eyes. Something was different. Dorian didn't see it. Maybe he never had. But Victor, just for a second, did. He clicked the remote again. Buzz. This time, Shadow didn't even twitch. He simply turned his head toward the far wall, toward the one direction where a sliver of daylight slipped beneath the closed door. It was barely a line, that light. Faint. Almost lost in the gloom of the cell. But it cut through the shadows like a lifeline, thin as a breath. And for a moment, just one suspended heartbeat, Victor could swear the dog was waiting for something. Not a command. Not the sting of punishment. Or the weight of another drill. Not fear dressed up as obedience. Something else entirely. Something human. The German Shepherd didn't move. He didn't growl or cower. He simply watched. That sliver of light, unmoving, patient, as if, through all the noise and chaos he had been built to endure, some small, unbroken part of him still believed that on the other side of that door there might be more. More than this sterile, windowless world. More than concrete floors and metal bars. More than the silence that screamed louder than violence. Victor found himself holding his breath. The clipboard in his hand felt suddenly heavy, absurdly out of place. He had read hundreds of behavioral charts, analyzed data, labeled dogs like this one as responsive, neutral, or compromised. But none of those words applied now. This wasn't science. It wasn't even instinct. It was longing. There was something in the dog's posture rigid but not tense. Ears tilted ever so slightly toward the light that didn't belong to conditioning. It belonged to memory, or hope, or maybe just that small, flickering thread that refused to snap no matter how many times it had been frayed. A thread called will. And Victor, the man who had signed off on tranquilizers, redacted field logs, and experimental therapies, suddenly felt like an intruder. A stranger in the presence of something sacred. Because this wasn't just a creature trained for war. This was a soul waiting. Waiting for a voice it remembered. For a touch that didn't hurt. For the sound of a name whispered softly. Not barked across a training field. He didn't know how he knew. He just did. The dog was waiting for someone. Not a handler. A person. The kind who smelled like the woods after rain. The kind who didn't flinch when he drew close. The kind who spoke in quiet tones, who saw past the scars, who treated him not like a weapon, but like a being. And in that sliver of light beneath the door, Victor didn't just see illumination. He saw resistance. Silent, still, but absolute. He didn't bark. He didn't shift. He He didn't even flinch when the trainer's boot tapped impatiently against the concrete floor. He just waited. Still, patient. Calm in a way that made Victor's chest tighten. It wasn't defiance born of strength. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the kind of resistance that doesn't bark or bite, but simply chooses to exist outside the chain of control. The dog's eyes, dimmed from too many shock collars, flickered in the low light of the cell. Not with fear, not with aggression, but with a quiet assertion of presence. Because waiting when you've been trained to never expect rescue is an act of rebellion. Victor took a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The man who had once cradled a clipboard like a lifeline now felt the weight of a whole other truth in his hands. This dog hadn't broken, not truly. Not deeply enough. Not yet. Somewhere, under the weight of every command he'd obeyed, every zap he'd endured, every moment he'd been taught to weaponize instinct, he was still searching. Searching for freedom. For home. For someone who hadn't given up. The sound of the trainer's footsteps coming closer jolted Victor back. He knew what was expected: push, test, obey, retreat. But he found he couldn't do it anymore. He swallowed hard. The trainer clicked the remote. Another pulse of electricity. Shadow flicked his ear. Blinked. Waited. No reaction. Victor's heart thundered with relief and dread. He tucked the remote into his pocket, his fingers tightening on the fabric. He wouldn't or couldn't take back the training, but he didn't have to push further. He didn't have to be the one to break the dog's will anymore. He waited, and that was enough. The trainer spat something under his breath: anger, frustration. Wounded Pretty Ann stalked out without another command. The echo of his boots lingered too long. Victor stepped into the cell quietly and crouched with measured gentleness on the opposite side of the dog. Shadow lifted his head, eyes meeting Victor's time. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was recognition. A silent understanding that shifted the air between them. Victor felt something inside him lift, a fragile shard of hope he thought had shattered months ago. "You hear that?" he whispered, though no one else was there. Even the overhead lights seemed to lean closer, not hostile, but curious. This wasn't obedience or fear. This was something else, something deeper. It was the birth of trust. Trust that had nothing to do with collar training or reinforcement schedules. Trust that sprang from small acts. Leaving leftover peanut butter in the bowl. Stepping away instead of reaching out. Giving empty space where commands used to live. Shadow felt it, and he waited for it. He leaned into it. He chose to stay, even when it would have been easier to panic, to snap, to obey. And that choice reverberated through Victor's ribs. For the first time since the program began, Victor realized that this dog had not broken. Somewhere beneath the surface injuries and broken circuits, he was still whole enough to reclaim himself. To reach beyond the training that had shaped him into a weapon. To recognize someone who saw less of his function and more of his soul. And Victor knew, in his bones, that the woman who had softened the dog's edges, Arden, had more power than any shock collar or remote transmitter. With nothing but her presence, she had begun to repair what training had tried to destroy. That realization shook Victor to his core. Where once he'd overseen obedience tests with a detached seriousness, now he saw the quiet dignity of a being deciding not to obey, not out of rebellion, but in remembrance of his right to choose. His hand rested lightly on Shadow's flank, feeling the steady beat of a heart that had once been considered too dangerous to trust. Each pulse was a drumbeat of resilience. Victor exhaled. "He's not broken," he said in a whisper, meant only for those 4 paws and patient eyes. Shadow didn't move, but his gaze softened. He closed his eyes, lowering his head just enough to convey that he understood, that he believed. A soft click came as Victor released the latch and opened the cell door. No words were needed. He stepped out. Shadow remained inside, for now, waiting, choosing. He wasn't ready to follow her. Maybe he was, but Victor knew the power was his to decide. Beyond the cell, the corridors stretched sterile and impassive, but Victor's steps felt different, lighter, yet more burdened with purpose. He carried something in his mind now, a truth he could never unsee, that even in darkness, even after war and pain and obedience drilled into flesh, there remains something unbreakable, something that waited, because sometimes rescue isn't a dramatic rush of heroism. It's a quiet surrender of expectations, a silent acknowledgement of another creature's right to be, to choose, to commit small acts of rebellion against brutality like continuing to wait. And God help them all, he just might find her. Because Arden's faith in him, Shadow was becoming his own. He'd come to understand that rescue wasn't always about saving a life that was lost. Sometimes it was about letting a life remember itself, and that could be the most radical renewal of all. The next steps wouldn't be easy. Shadow's program still had a contract. There were logs to scrub, opinions to shield, protocols to break. But something fundamental had shifted. Victor's hand fell to his side as he approached the large windows overlooking the yard. The night was still, the moon high above, and there, beneath its silver glow, he saw her, Arden, her silhouette framed by the home she had claimed. Waiting, listening, being. Their eyes met through the glass. Shadow's silhouette stirred beside her. The outline of his body, upright and waiting, spoke of choice quiet, but resolute. Victor felt his throat tighten. This was more than training inspiring obedience. This was healing inspiring choice. This was love. And if love could bring a dog back, could it bring more back? More humans too, broken by duty and conditioned to follow? Could they remember themselves? Victor realized, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that what they had witnessed was not just the faint flicker of memory, it was the first spark of revival. Shadow stood still. Arden noticed. She lifted her hand again, pressed it to the glass. He responded by leaning forward, his muzzle kissing her palm. The chain between bars and window held their bond like a vow. He had chosen to stay, not because he obeyed, because he remembered what being himself felt like, and that choice, alone, carried more gravity than obedience ever could. He had found his freedom. He had found his home. Beneath the soft glow of porch light, under the watch of a girl who saw more than his scars, Shadow was learning to live again. And peace elusive and precious finally found its way through the quiet resistance of waiting. The hum of engines began before the first car even crested the drive. From her bedroom window on the second floor, Arden sat quietly in her wheelchair, hands folded over the faded blanket draped across her legs. The morning was too still, like the breath before a scream. Below her, gravel crunched in slow rhythm. Black SUVs rolled in one after another, all tinted glass and glossy intimidation. Their tires pressed lines into the dirt like signatures that didn't want to be read. The vehicles parked with military precision, perfectly spaced. Doors opened in sync. Men in pressed uniforms stepped out, gold pins glinting like sharp teeth beneath the sun. Others wore tailored suits, with expressions that didn't blink and eyes that measured things too quickly. They weren't guests. They were watchers, deciders, people who made things happen and erased things when needed. Arden leaned closer to the window. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she could feel it, that subtle tightening in her chest. Not fear exactly, but proximity to it, like thunder that hasn't yet cracked. She recognized one of them, Brigadier Halverson, a silver-haired man she had seen once in a photograph beside her father, back before the surgeries, the silence, and the reshaped house filled with ramps. He smiled politely at someone and adjusted his metal-heavy jacket. But even from here, Arden could see the disinterest behind his eyes. A man who showed up to shake hands and sign off, nothing more. And there walking toward them with practiced ease was Dorian. His gait was smooth, controlled, a host playing gracious under pressure. His suit was immaculate, his smile warm enough to pass for sincerity. He laughed at the right cues, gripped hands like he meant it, thanked them for coming as if this were a reunion and not a performance. But Arden knew that smile. She had seen it last week when Elena found bruises on Shadow's ribs. She had seen it when he dismissed her questions with, "Some dogs bruise easier than others." It was the smile he wore when hiding something foul. The sky had turned the color of old steel, and a wind moved through the trees like something uncertain. Even the horses in the south pasture were wrestles' heads raised, nostrils flaring. Arden watched Dorian lead the guests toward the arena. She saw the way he motioned toward the training facilities with a sweep of his arm. She couldn't hear the words, but she could guess the script. Innovation, tactical efficiency, loyalty under command. Words that polished cruelty into presentation. She whispered into the quiet room, "They don't know." Shadow's name stayed caught in her throat. She felt it that this wasn't just about dogs or military contracts. Something underneath all this was wrong in a deeper, bone-deep way. A performance built on lies. Arden's hand curled over the sketch hidden in the pouch of her wheelchair. The one of Shadow not snarling or baring teeth, but soft-eyed, watching something off-page. A dog not made for violence, but forced to wear it. She wheeled herself back from the window. The demonstration was beginning, and something inside her knew today everything could break. The hallway smelled of polish and distance too clean, too quiet. Arden rolled steadily toward the front door, the wheels of her chair whispering against the hardwood floor. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept moving, jaw clenched, eyes set on the fading rectangle of sunlight that stretched across the foyer. Behind her, Elena's voice cracked through the quiet. "Arden, don't!" She stepped in front of her daughter, one hand braced on the doorway like it might hold back the world. "Please stay inside. Whatever's happening out there, it's not safe. It's not for us to interfere." Arden didn't meet her gaze at first. Her fingers traced the edge of her chair's worn armrest, the place where her thumb always rested when she was nervous. "He'll need me there," she said softly, almost like it was a confession. "They're going to try something. And if I'm not there, he might forget." "Forget what?" Arden finally looked up. "That he's not what they made him to be. That there's more to him than command and consequence." Elena dropped her gaze, the breath leaving her like a sigh. She stepped back, just slightly, the way mothers do when they know they can't stop the tide, only witness its movement. Outside, clouds churned over the field like ink in water. The wind carried the metallic scent of coming rain and tension already in motion. Trucks were parked near the demonstration ring. Guests were beginning to gather, their conversation crisp and rehearsed. As Arden wheeled herself forward, Luis stood near the side barn, adjusting a loose strap on his leather tool belt. His eyes met Elena's for the briefest of moments, and then dipped to the small recording device tucked into his jacket collar. It blinked once, red. He gave a small nod, subtle and sure. He wasn't trained for this. He was a stable hand, not a spy. But he had ears and a heart that didn't sit right when people were hurt for someone else's gain. When he'd overheard Dorian talking about optics, about how Arden's scream would be the final cue to destroy Shadow, something in him snapped. Now his hands were steady, eyes alert. He moved like someone on borrowed courage. Back on the path to the training arena, Arden passed the fence where she had once first seen Shadow watching her from behind rusted wire. The dirt was softer here from years of pacing, the air tighter with memories. "He knows me," she whispered to no one, "and I know him." No guard stopped her. Dorian hadn't expected her to come. Maybe he thought Elena would keep her inside. Maybe he thought she was too afraid, too broken, too late. But she kept rolling forward. The kind of rebellion that doesn't shout, just keeps showing up anyway. The air crackled with the kind of silence that settles just before a storm, breaks thick, expectant, on edge. Guests stood in a neat semicircle near the training field, clipboards in hand, expressions fixed into polite curiosity. The clouds above hung heavy, swollen with unshed rain, casting long shadows across the dirt. Dorian stepped forward, voice smooth, gestures precise. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to witness is the future of tactical response, a demonstration of precision conditioning, even under unpredictable civilian circumstances." Oh. Beside him, Victor stood with the remote tucked discreetly in his palm, fingers coiled around the trigger like it was a lifeline. His eyes didn't track the audience. They were locked on Shadow, who stood inside the crate just beyond the arena, body taut, breathing shallow. The black tactical collar blinked red slow, steady pulses. Each flash reflected off his dark coat like a wound reopening. Shadow stepped out when the gate lifted, but not like a dog ready for orders. He moved like something being pushed forward by invisible hands. Mechanical, muzzled, empty. Across the field, Arden waited. Her chair was parked just beyond the demonstration line, front wheels angled slightly into the dirt. She wasn't supposed to be here, but no one stopped her now, not when the scene was already set. She had braided her hair that morning, hands shaking the whole time. In her lap was the sketch she'd drawn, the one where Shadow didn't look fierce, just tired. Dorian gave Victor a small, imperceptible nod. Click! The collar jolted alive. A sudden pulse, not enough to be visible but sharp, coercive. Shadow jerked, ears pinned back, head twisting toward Arden like a blade honing in on a target. The change was instant. His body snapped into drive. Muscles fired. Paws dug into the earth. He charged. People gasped. Elena screamed from the edge of the crowd. One man instinctively reached for the sidearm he wasn't permitted to carry. Arden didn't move. She watched him come his face, a blur of instinct and confusion, the world narrowing to the thudding of his paws and the heat in his chest. The collar blinked faster now. Red, red, red. 20 feet. 10. 5. Then nothing. No impact. No scream. Just shadow. Skidding to a halt in front of Arden. Dirt spraying in an arc. Claws scraping dry earth. He stood there, panting hard, head shaking like he was trying to throw something off. Something cruel and buried. Then he collapsed. Right there. At her feet. His body hit the ground with a dull thud, but not like he had been defeated. Like he had chosen. Arden blinked through the dust, kicked up around them. Shadow didn't snarl, didn't growl. His chest rose and fell in short, uneven breaths. He lifted his head just enough to look up at Harrier's wide, wet, bewildered, pleading. Not for mercy, for recognition. For her to see that he hadn't forgotten. That something stronger than pain had held him back. It wasn't training. It wasn't instinct. It was memory. Something fragile and flickering, buried deep beneath commands and conditioning rising now like a breath breaking through water. Arden's sketch slipped from her hands, falling to the dirt like a leaf in slow motion. The edges fluttered with the wind, forgotten, as her eyes locked on the dog before her. Shadow was trembling not with fear, but with the weight of a decision. Muscles coiled, ears pinned back, chest heaving. His eyes, once vacant and drilled for obedience, now held something achingly human. Recognition. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberate. No sudden moves. Her fingers shook as she reached for him. Each inch of distance closed like crossing a fault line. Then finally her hand came to rest on his muzzle. Gentle, unafraid. Not to command, not to control, but to connect. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice thin and breaking. "You remembered." His body stilled, his breathing slowed, and for one suspended heartbeat, time held its breath. "Behind them!" someone shouted. A man's voice, furious. Dorian's. Orders cracked through the air like gunfire, desperate attempts to reclaim control. Chaos erupted, boots rushing, metal clanging, the illusion shattering around them like glass underfoot. But none of it mattered, because Shadow didn't move, didn't turn, didn't follow the voice that once shaped him. Instead, he leaned forward just slightly and pressed his head into Arden's hand. A hush fell. It was as if the world had paused to witness it. This simple, quiet rebellion, not of violence, but of will. Not a breaking point, but a choosing point. And everyone saw it. From the stunned officers at the perimeter to the techs still frozen at their stations, every witness in that space understood what had just happened, even if they couldn't explain it. A dog had remembered something greater than programming, greater than fear. He had remembered love. Dorian stumbled backward, his face drained of color, yelling into the void like a man already lost. His words rang hollow now. No one listened, because the center of the storm was no longer his. It was Arden and Shadow. He had chosen her. Not because she ordered it, not because she controlled him, but because when everything else in his world had collapsed, her voice remained. Her touch, her trust, her quiet belief that somewhere deep inside the weapon they'd made was still a soul worth saving. And now, here it was. Shadow stood guard not as a tool, but as something far more dangerous to men like Dorian. A free being, a protector by choice. His stance widened, his head lifted. Not aggressive, just immovable. Arden knelt beside him, tears spilling freely, one hand never leaving his fur. In that moment, she wasn't a patient. He wasn't a project. They were survivors, not just of battles waged in the shadows, but of everything that had come before the betrayals. The orders barked without care. The silent night spent waiting for something more. For a long time, they had walked separate paths. Arden with her quiet defiance, her belief that healing was possible, even when the world insisted on turning pain into protocol. And Shadow, forged in fire and command, molded by hands that saw him as nothing more than a weapon sharp, silent, and disposable. But not anymore. This was their stand. There was no gunfire, no sirens, no blaring alarms or breaking news tickers. Just two figures own human, one canina-rooted in something deeper than survival, rooted in choice, in truth, in the refusal to be used any longer. Whatever came next, whatever fallout or reckoning would begin here. Maybe it would start with whispers, with questions behind closed doors. Maybe there'd be subpoenas or men in suits knocking on Arden's door. Maybe there'd be consequences Victor couldn't shield them from. But that didn't matter, because the silence was over. The veil had been lifted. And for the first time in years, the world would have to look into the eyes of what it created and what it tried to discard. Shadow had remembered who he was, not through conditioning, not through fear, but through love. He remembered the taste of peanut butter, smeared on fingertips instead of masked in sedatives. He remembered the wind curling through grass under open skies, not through vents in a caged facility. He remembered Arden's voice in a commanding, not training, but simply speaking, like he was something more than machinery. He remembered being seen. And now, standing beside her in the growing dusk, he wasn't just a dog rescued from a program. He was a presence, a choice, a being who had once been trained to disappear into shadow, now standing in full light. The cameras had started rolling days ago, hidden lenses and long lenses, surveillance drones and subtle interviews. Victor had leaked just enough. The whistleblowing wouldn't be clean. It never was. But the story was out there now. A military-grade canine, reprogrammed to kill, abandoned after a mission gone wrong found, healed, and awakened by someone the government didn't see coming. A girl with a broken past, a heart big enough to hold trauma and still offer warmth. A home not built with steel or clearance codes, but with late nights, soft words, and open space. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't tactical. It was real. And that's what made it dangerous to the people who built systems like the one that broke him. They had trained Shadow to detect bombs, to neutralize threats, to read the nervous tics of human behavior. But what they hadn't planned on was that he'd learn to read peace, too. Safety, tenderness, the absence of fear. They never planned for what would happen when a dog stopped obeying out of fear and started choosing because of love. That was never part of the protocol. But it was happening. It had happened. And this time, the whole world was watching. Some tuned in out of curiosity, others out of outrage. But most stayed because they felt something stir deep in their bones when they looked at him. The dog with intelligent eyes. The girl beside him with scars she never tried to hide. The kind of pairing that didn't need words to be understood. People saw themselves in that image. They saw grief and healing, pain and trust, the courage to stay, even when you could run. And that was what made the story impossible to ignore. Journalists dug into the funding behind the K9 program. Activists pulled archived footage of retired dogs being auctioned off like old equipment. Veterans came forward with stories they had buried, memories of canine partners left behind because mission parameters had changed. And in the center of that rising storm stood Shadow, no longer a file, no longer a subject, no longer an asset. He was a witness. And Arden, the girl who gave him back his name, was his voice. Together, they weren't just survivors of a broken system. They were challengers of it. Arden didn't have a media team. She didn't want a foundation, or a book deal, or a speaking tour. What she wanted, what she fought for, was dignity. For Shadow, for dogs like him, for people like her, for anyone who had ever been silenced by pain and turned into a footnote. She didn't scream. She didn't fight dirty. She just kept showing up with Shadow beside Herond. That quiet insistence became thunder in a world that had gotten used to tuning out the truth. And in that quiet, something began to change. Shelters reported a surge in German Shepherd adoptions. Local agencies reviewed how their retired dogs were treated. Congress quietly tabled a hearing. But even without all that, something else had shifted. People felt again. They looked at Shadow and remembered that pain has a face, that healing takes time, that loyalty cannot be programmed, only earned. That love, even when it comes in silence and fur and slow trust, is still love, and it changes everything. That's what made this a stand. Not because they were loud, but because they were honest. Not because they fought, but because they stayed. They had every reason to run, to disappear, to shut down, but they didn't. Arden faced the world with her hands open. Shadow faced it with eyes steady. And in doing so, they gave others permission to remember who they were too. Survivors. And maybe, just maybe, something more. The silence was deafening. Shadow lay curled at Arden's feet, the dirt beneath him disturbed by the skid of his own resistance. His sides rose and fell with jagged breath, muscles still twitching with the residue of violence that had almost been. The collar blinked once more, then dimmed, a spent threat. Arden leaned forward, hand still resting lightly against the side of his face. Her voice was a whisper knot meant for the cameras, not for the generals or the donors or the eyes that had only come to watch a performance. It was for him. "You didn't want to," she murmured, her fingers trembling slightly against his jaw. "I know." And somehow, though he couldn't speak, couldn't nod, he stilled, as if those words gave his body permission to stop fighting what had been forced into him. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Then another. The moment stretched, disobedient and raw. The kind of moment no one writes into official reports but stays burned behind eyelids for years. Dorian's composure broke. "What is this?" he snapped, his smile gone, mask cracked down the center. "He's malfunctioning. That collar, Victor. Check the damn collar." But it was too late. Because the crowd had seen. Not aggression. Not a calculated show of control. They'd seen a dog flinch away from violence. They'd seen a girl, broken but unafraid, whisper forgiveness to something the world had already judged. And now they saw Luis. The stable hand had stepped forward from the edge of the arena, one hand inside his jacket. His face was pale, throat tight, but his eyes held the same steady heat they always did when brushing the horses focused, sure, unwilling to look away. "I wouldn't do that," he said, as Victor took a step toward Arden and Shadow. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the chaos. Luis pulled a small device from his pocket, a recorder. One button lit green, and then it has to look like an accident. The girl screams. The dog lunges. We all win. The voice was Dorian's. Clear, measured, unmistakable. Another voice, Victor's, followed. "I'll time it right. He won't know what hit him. Neither will she." Gasps erupted, now unfiltered. Several guests stepped back instinctively. One woman pulled her phone up to start recording. Another was already calling someone. Dorian went pale, then flushed a sickly shade of red. "That's a fake," he barked. "This is a setup. That boy's lying. He's just a stable hand." But the words rang hollow. Luis looked at Arden, then back at the crowd. "Check the timestamp. I made copies. One's already been sent to the base commander's inbox." Victor froze. Dorian took one step toward Luis, only to find himself blocked by Elena, stepping out of the crowd with her badge visible and hand resting on her sidearm. "This ends here," she said quietly. No one moved for a beat. Then, as if a spell broke, the space erupted murmurs, motion, officials talking into radios. Shadow didn't move. Arden stayed with him, her body still leaned forward, eyes closed for a second too long. And then she opened them, lifted her chin, and met the storm head on. Elena moved forward slowly, her badge catching the afternoon light, her voice steady as stone. "Dorian Marsh, you're under investigation for conspiracy to commit assault with intent to defame and destroy evidence," she said, loud enough for the entire arena to hear. Dorian turned, laughter sharp and hollow. "You're joking." "No," she said flatly. "But you were, when you thought no one was listening." Murmurs sparked like static across the field. Black SUVs idled in the distance. Some guests took steps back, away from Dorian, as if corruption could be contagious. He scoffed, stepping toward her. "You don't have jurisdiction here." "I don't need jurisdiction," Elena replied. "I have proof. I have witnesses." His foot hit the dirt hard. "That dog's a liability, and Shesh is a PR mess." That's when it happened. A low, guttural growl rolled through the silence. Shadow. His body was still crouched beside Arden, but his eyes had locked onto Dorian the second the man stepped toward Elena. His ears pulled back, lips peeled up, and when Dorian took one more step, Shadow surged forward. Not attacking, but putting himself between Arden and the threat. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't trained. It was choice. Dorian flinched, stopping cold. Shadow's growl rumbled deeper, now less warning. More promise. Dorian raised both hands. That mutt's unstable. And? He's not unstable, Arden said from behind him. He just knows who's dangerous. Every head turned. And Victor, who had stood frozen near the fence, Line took a trembling step forward. The remote trigger dangled from his hand, blinking weakly. Then, without a word, he dropped it. The thud was small. The impact wasn't anarchy. I didn't know, Victor said hoarsely. They told me it was a controlled target, a test. They didn't say it was a kid. His voice cracked. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. Luis, nearby, exhaled for the first time in minutes. Elena turned her attention back to Dorian. That's two. Keep talking. And maybe we don't need a third. Dorian's jaw flexed. His eyes darted to the crowd phones raised, some streaming, all recording. He was cornered. But worse than Thaith was seen. The man behind the suit, the cold smile, the practiced pitch. No longer a visionary, just a fraud. Shadow lowered his head slightly but never broke eye contact. And this time, no collar beeped. No remote buzzed. Only truth filled the air, and it was louder than any command. The crunch of tires over gravel was the only sound as the sheriff's cruiser pulled up beside the demonstration ring. Its red and blue lights spun silently, flickering across the stunned faces of onlookers. Shadow's ears twitched. He didn't move. Sheriff Ray stepped out with a grim expression and a pair of cuffs already in hand. Dorian Marsh, she called clearly. Step forward. Hands visible. Dorian's smirk had long since vanished. Now, he looked smaller, shrunken inside the frame of his once tailored blazer. Still, he opened his mouth probably to lie, probably to spin, but no words came. He turned, wrists trembling as he held them out. Click, click. The sound of metal on bone echoed louder than the scattered whispers behind camera phones. Some guests looked away. Some didn't bother hiding their disgust. One by one, they began walking back to their cars, suits and heels and polished boots retreating from the man they once called visionary. His empire had cracked. And this was the sound of it falling. Elena stood by silently as Reyes read Dorian his rights. Shadow remained close to Arden, his massive head brushing her side gently as if to ask, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer him right away. She just watched Dorian being led away, watched the guests scatter like dry leaves. Then, softly, barely louder than the wind that had started to stir, "Did he hate me because I couldn't walk?" The question wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It just hung there raw, aching. Elena kneeled beside her, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "No, honey," she said. "He hated what he couldn't control." She let the words settle, then added gently, "But with the strength of someone who knew. But you chose love. Even when you had every reason not to. That's what made you dangerous to him." Shadow laid his chin across Arden's lap like a vow. Not a command, not a submission. A choice. A quiet declaration from a creature who had once known nothing but orders and consequences, now learning the sacred silence of belonging. His breath was slow, steady warm against her folded hands. His weight, gentle but certain, told her more than words ever could. And in the distance, the clouds that had loomed all afternoon finally began to break rays of light piercing through like something new could begin. The sun didn't burst forth in triumph. It arrived slowly, humbly, threading gold into gray, as if the sky itself wasn't quite sure it had permission to hope yet. But it came anyway, and that was enough. The hospital steps were still behind them. The reporters had long packed up. The cameras, the microphones, the security staff who once flinched at the sight of Shadow gone. What remained now was quieter. The hum of wind brushing through dry leaves, the soft groan of Arden's wheelchair as she adjusted herself, and the rhythmic thump of Shadow's tail knot wagging in excitement, but in presence, because justice wasn't just punishment. It wasn't about headlines or vengeance or even courtrooms, though all of that would have its place in due time. Justice, real justice, was something more subtle. It was the slow dismantling of a lie, the deliberate naming of things that had once been buried programs, pain, ghosts dressed in protocol. It was Arden refusing to flinch when the past showed up on her doorstep, and Shadow refusing to hide when they called him dangerous, defective, beyond redemption. It was truth seen. Not just the kind written into reports or blasted through headlines, but the kind etched into eyes, scars, and second chances. The kind you carry with you. Arden had seen it when she first laid eyes on Shadow at the shelter, tucked in the farthest corner, muscles tense beneath his fur, eyes alert but dulled. Everyone else had walked past. He wasn't adoptable, they said. Too risky, too unpredictable. But Arden hadn't listened to that voice, because something in her, broken and bruised in its own way, recognized something in him. A mirror. Maybe. A warning. A dare. And now, sitting outside the very place where secrets had once been stitched into his bones, they both knew it hadn't been a coincidence. It had been a beginning. It was loyalty proven. Not loyalty demanded or forced. Not the kind measured in how quickly a command was obeyed or how perfectly a maneuver was executed. No. This was older, more sacred. It was the kind of loyalty that survived abandonment. The kind that chose to stay, even after everything. Shadow hadn't run when the cameras came. He hadn't flinched when the footage aired. He hadn't retreated when strangers pointed and whispered and brought back words like dangerous, trained, weapon. He had stayed, at her side, behind her wheelchair. In the corners of each long night, when sleep didn't come easy. In the waiting rooms, in the courtroom, in the silence between press conferences, he hadn't barked, he hadn't lunged, he hadn't made a show of himself. He had simply existed with her, and that was the most radical thing of all. It was a girl in a wheelchair and a dog with a past choosing each other again. No one could have written that kind of ending, because it wasn't an ending at all. It was a turning, a soft pivot in the timeline, the moment when survival gave way to healing, and healing gave way to something even braver, presence. Arden shifted slightly, brushing her fingers over the top of Shadow's head. His fur was thick, still coarse in places where scars had settled. Her hand lingered near the base of his neck, where the collar used to rub raw during the early days of his conditioning. Now, he wore no collar, no tags, just trust. She leaned down, forehead nearly touching his. "You stayed," she whispered. He blinked once, slowly, as if to say, "Of course." The wind picked up, but it was gentle this time. It didn't sting. It carried the scent of early spring damp earth, pine, the faint sweetness of distant wildflowers just beginning to stretch. And Arden breathed it in like medicine. Somewhere in the courtyard, a nurse wheeled another patient past. The woman nodded toward Ardensoft, understanding. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, because even she could feel it. Something had shifted. Shadow lifted his head, ears flicking forward. Alert, but calm. He didn't move to guard. He didn't tense. He just watched. And that was enough. It always had been. Not so long ago, Arden had wondered if she'd ever trust again. Not just people, but time. She'd been in rooms where the air felt hollow, where doctors spoke of prognosis like mathematics, where hope was rationed like medication. And yet here she was, outside, breathing, not whole, but held. And beside her, a dog who had been trained to erase himself, now refusing to disappear. The clouds broke a little more. Sunlight spilled across the pavement in fractured, golden slats. One beam caught Shadow's eyes, lighting them like amber caught in glass. Arden reached up and wiped the corner of her eye, not because she was sad, but because something this quiet, this brave, could still make her cry. In a world so obsessed with outcomes, this was the reward. Not victory, not fame, but a presence that had every reason to flee, and chose instead to rest its head on her lap like a vow. Not a promise of forever, but a promise of now. And sometimes Arden thought, now is the most sacred thing we ever get. Shadow's tail tapped once against the wheel of her chair. She smiled. The road ahead would still have potholes, trials, media storms, maybe even threats. But that no longer scared her, because she wasn't alone in it. She had her Shadow, not because he followed, but because he had chosen to stay. And that made all the difference. The morning after the storm didn't begin with thunder or sunlight. It began with paperwork ink on white, dry signatures that carried the weight of broken legacies and new beginnings. Elena stood in the dusty office where Dorian Marsh once held court. The bookshelves behind her were bare now, stripped of the vanity trophies and leather-bound illusions of control. The air still smelled faintly of cigar smoke and cruelty. But the silence? That was new. Clean. Beside her, a lawyer in a gray suit handed over the final documents. "Miss Rivera," he said formally, "you now hold full legal control over the Arden Ridge estate, its training program, and all affiliated assets." Elena didn't smile. Not yet. She just took the pen, signed her name, and whispered under her breath, "This place will never be a weapon again." Outside the office window, the once immaculate fields were no longer staging grounds. The training poles stood quiet. The steel gates, once symbols of power, now served only to keep the peace within. Everything Dorian had built, every lie stitched into the program's DNA, was unraveling. The news broke faster than Elena expected. By mid-morning, national outlets had picked up Luis's audio recording. Attempted child harm, animal cruelty, weaponized obedience. The headlines read. Shadow's photo was everywhere, first shown mid-charge, a blur of muscle and intensity. But then, the footage shifted. Him lying at Arden's feet, unmoving, eyes wide, waiting for forgiveness that was never asked for. They called it the demonstration that backfired. They didn't know the half of it. By afternoon, government contracts were frozen. Military sponsors pulled out. Investigations were launched into other private canine programs tied to Marsh. Protesters began gathering at the gates and with signs. Others just silent, their presence a demand that someone, finally, tell the truth. Inside the estate, Elena stood at the center of it all. She wore no uniform. She didn't need one. Luis walked up from the stable, holding a folder thick with notes and timestamps. "That's every recorded session Victor ever logged," he said. "Shadow's whole timeline. We can prove they conditioned him for aggression around mobility aids." And Elena took the folder, heavy in her hands, and nodded. "We'll give it to the press," she said. "But more importantly, we'll give it to him. His story's not over." In the far corner of the yard, Arden sat cross-legged in the grass. Shadow's head rested in her lap as her fingers traced slow, patient circles behind his ears. The sunlight had returned, shyly, through drifting clouds. Elena watched them for a long moment. Two survivors, broken by the same man in different ways, choosing day after day not to stay broken. A knock came at the gate. It was a delivery van, small and nondescript. Inside, blankets, food, collars, leashes, donated supplies from a rescue foundation that had seen the footage and wanted to help. Elena exhaled for the first time in days. "Good," she said softly, almost to herself. "Let's turn this place into something it was never meant to be. Not a weapon, not a stage, but a sanctuary." The kennels were no longer echo chambers of obedience. No more buzzes, no more barked commands that cracked like whips. Only silence and sunlight. Arden moved slowly down the corridor, her hands resting on the armrests of her wheelchair, her fingers slightly curled from the chill of early morning. Beside her, Shadow walked without a leash. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. His gait was cautious at first, as if each step over the soft grass was a question. The gravel training grid had been dug up 2 days ago, placed with soil, seeded, and rolled by volunteers who came after the story broke. Tiny blades of green now sprouted in the sun, soft and forgiving under his paws. As they passed what used to be the shock station room, Shadow's ears twitched, his body tensed just a flicker. Arden reached out, barely brushing the thick fur of his shoulder. "You're not there anymore," she said gently. "It's gone." The door to the room stood wide open now, no longer locked, no longer humming with hidden threat. The control panels were ripped out, the remote triggers destroyed. A mural had been painted on the wall just 2 nights before. It showed a field, open and wild, with a dog and child running freely under a blue sky. Shadow stared at it for a long while. Then, slowly, his tail swayed once. Then again. Elena emerged from the back hallway, her arms crossed, her expression softening when she saw them. "You know," she said, voice low, When I first walked into this place, it smelled like bleach and fear. Arden looked around. The walls were now repainted in earthy tones. Soft lighting replaced the flickering fluorescence. Someone had even hung wind chimes near the kennel windows. Elena continued, "We've still got a long way to go. But this is where healing starts." Shadow looked up at her, not with wariness, not with obedience, with awareness. "Un moment passable, profound." He stepped forward, not toward Elena, but toward an open kennel at the end of the hall, one that had a soft blanket folded inside. No lock, no chain, just space and a small rubber ball. Shadow sniffed it, then gently nosed the blanket, circling once before laying down, not curled tight like fear had taught him, but stretched out, ears relaxed, eyes open. Arden smiled, blinking away something behind her lashes. "He chose it," she whispered. Elena nodded. For the first time in his life, probably. Outside, birds called softly from the sycamores. A wind lifted dust from the corners of the old yard and carried it away far from teeth and triggers and everything he was forced to become. Inside the kennel, Shadow rested his head on his paws. His eyes met, Ardenson held, and something wordless passed between them. Not command, not duty, just trust. They came one by one, scarred, limping, eyes dulled by commands they couldn't unhear. Some bore the weight of old harnesses. Others arrived with silence so thick it felt like grief. But they came tired, discarded, or broken, in ways no report had ever bothered to document. And they were welcomed. The gates of the ranch no longer slammed shut. They creaked open every week, steady as the promise they now carried. Elena stood by them, clipboard in hand, arms wide not to judge, but to receive. Arden watched from the hill, Shadow lying beside her wheelchair, his breath slow and even. A year ago, he wouldn't have let another dog within 10 feet. Now, he lifted his head gently when the new ones came, ears forward, tail still, watchful, but calm. The rehabilitation center had no cages, now only open runs, shaded spaces, and kennels that looked more like cabins. Volunteers lined the gravel path. Many were children. Some in wheelchairs like Arden, others with prosthetics or tremors in their hands. But every one of them held something that could not be trained into a doggedly offered freely. Trust, joy. A little boy named Milo wheeled himself forward toward a golden retriever missing part of one hind leg. He didn't hesitate, just held out a treat and whispered, "Hi, buddy." The dog didn't flinch. He wagged. A girl with cerebral palsy reached out slowly to scratch behind a German shepherd's ear. The dog leaned into her touch, as if it had been waiting its whole life for that moment. The yard echoed not with barks or orders but with laughter. Wheels spun over grass. Tennis balls flew through the air. And dogs who once knew only obedience or violence now chased joy like it was instinct. At the center of it all sat Arden in Shadow. She wore a sun hat that flopped too far over one eye. He sat beside her, tongue lolling, a faint white scar still visible near his collar but no longer defining him. A small girl barely 4 approached, dragging a stuffed animal in one hand and holding a brush in the other. She looked at Shadow. "Can I?" Arden smiled. "He loves being brushed." The girl giggled, dropping down carefully beside the big dog. Shadow didn't move, just watched her with warm eyes, letting the bristles pass over his coat. Each stroke of the brush was uneven, clumsy in the way only a 5-year-old could manage, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he blinked slowly, content to let her be near, even as she accidentally tugged a little too hard, or missed entirely and patted his ribs instead. He let her get close in a way that once would have triggered every alarm in his trained mind. But not here. Not anymore. Elena, from across the yard, paused her work and looked over the scene. Her throat tightened. "This was never the plan," she said aloud to no one in particular. The garden gloves hung limp in her hands. She had come outside with the intent to pull weeds, to prepare the beds for spring planting, to do something that gave her hands a task. But now, watching the girl kneel beside the German shepherd, once labeled dangerous by a government document, her body went still. Louise, standing near a bench, grinned. "Number, it's better." And it was. The sun was just beginning to tilt into that late afternoon glow, where everything softened edges, shadows, even the noise in one's own mind. The wind shifted slightly, sending a cool breath through the trees, and the old wind chimes danced softly under the porch roof. They had been silent all winter. Today, they sang. A new day, a new rhythm. Shadow turned to Arden. She was watching too, her hands folded in her lap, a blanket tucked over her legs. Her wheelchair was parked near the jasmine trellis Louise had repaired last week. She didn't speak at first, didn't need to. There was something sacred in this kind of silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Then, as if the words had been resting in her chest, waiting for the right moment, she leaned forward slightly. Her hand found the familiar curve of Shadow's shoulder. "You were never broken," she whispered to him. "You just didn't have the right place to heal." Shadow closed his eyes at her voice, tilting his head just enough to press his weight gently against her knee. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even intentional in the human sense. It was instinct, connection. The way the body remembers before the mind catches up. And Arden's hand didn't move. She let it rest there, fingers splayed, as if anchoring them both to this exact moment. Because here under sunlight, and the smell of earth and child laughter was the proof. He wasn't a soldier anymore. Not a weapon. Not an asset or a liability. He was a dog. Still fierce. Still brilliant. But free. And she wasn't the girl everyone had once pitied. The one in the wheelchair. The one whispered about in hallways. The one the program had nearly erased. They were more than survivors now. They were builders. This place, this stretch of land that had once been a rundown farmhouse, now rebuilt with donated lumber, volunteers, and stubborn hope, had become something living, a sanctuary. Not just in name, but in soul. People came here now, not to fix Shadow, not to poke at Arden's story, but to be reminded that healing wasn't linear, that it wasn't quiet or neat or always comfortable, but it was real, and it was possible. Children came to read to the dogs, to brush their fur, to sit quietly beside them in silence that required no explanation. Veterans came too, some limping, some haunted, some reluctant to even step out of their cars. But eventually they did, one by one. And the dogs didn't ask for anything except presence. The same way Shadow had once waited for Arden wordless, and still, a kind of rebellion against every order he'd been taught to obey. This place had become that for others. Because Arden and Shadow had chosen not just to survive what had been done to them, but to build something no one could take away. And now, they'd built it, together. The little girl beside Shadow leaned forward, whispering something into his ear. No one else could hear it. Whatever it was, it made her giggle again, and Shadow gave a soft grunt in response. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a command. It was a sound like agreement. Louise walked over and bent to kiss the top of Arden's head, his palm brushing her shoulder briefly. "They said no one could fix him," he murmured. "I didn't," she replied. He smiled. "Number you never did." Behind them, the screen door creaked open, and Elena called out that dinner would be ready in 20. The smell of rosemary and roasted vegetables wafted out into the yard. The girl looked up at the mention of food, gave Shadow one last hug, and ran toward the porch with the abandon only children can afford. Shadow didn't follow. He stayed where he was. His ears twitched, but his body remained next to Arden. She reached for his collar knot to grab, or control butt, to feel the weight of it in her hand. No tags, no number, just a small metal plate, etched, with one word, found. And that's what he was. Not lost, not abandoned, not programmed, not erased. Found. She let the word echo in her chest for a moment, then leaned back in her chair, eyes tilted toward the sky. The clouds were thinning. The wind was settling. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of children laughing mixed with the low chime of bells and the soft, steady breath of a dog who had learned to rest. Together, they had built something more powerful than any weapon, more enduring than any memory of war or pain. They had built peace. The old barn had changed. Where once crates and training gear lined the walls, now there were easels, folding chairs, and light-warm light that spilled through the tall windows and onto the polished floor. They called it the studio, but it was more than that. It was where things were spoken, and where things unspoken were finally understood. Arden sat in her chair near the window, sketchpad resting on her knees. Shadow sprawled at her side. His ears twitched at the sound of laughter across the room. Soft, tentative kind that came when someone forgot, just for a moment, how heavy they'd been feeling. Today's therapy group was smaller than usual. A boy named Lucas, who hadn't spoken since his brother passed away, was painting wide, abstract strokes in deep blue. Beside him, a woman with Parkinson's sketched slowly with her left hand, her right shaking gently in her lap. Two veterans were sitting across from each other, not talking but not leaving either. And in the center of the room, Arden held the silence together without even trying, just being there. Shadow, too, had learned the art of stillness. He didn't walk up to anyone unless invited. But his presence, steady, quiet, loyal, gave people the courage to stay just a little longer. That's when Luna arrived. A Belgian Malinois, younger than most. Thin, jumpy fur still patchy from old burns. Her handler, a volunteer named Maya, barely had time to unclip the leash before Luna bolted to a corner and curled into herself, trembling hard. No one moved at first, just the sound of brushes, the quiet whir of a wheelchair. But Arden saw it, and so did Shadow. "Stay," Arden whispered, placing a hand gently on his back. "Let her come to us." "Oh." He obeyed, lowering his body, tail gently thumping once then stopping. No stare, no pressure, just a presence. Minutes passed. Luna didn't move. But then, Arden began sketching. Not Luna, not Shadow, but safety. A child curled next to a dog, a fireplace in the background, light glowing between their silhouettes. She held the drawing up, facing Luna without saying a word. The dog tilted her head, still trembling, but now, looking. Shadow lifted his nose, not toward her but toward Arden's open palm, as if to say, "It's okay, it's safe here, you choose." Slowly, like pulling herself out of water, Luna crept forward. Not to the food dish, not to Maya, but to Shadow. Her body low, tail tucked, but moving. Shadow didn't flinch. He lowered his head even further. No sound, no signal, just stillness. Luna pressed her forehead, barely grazing his side, then dropped to the floor beside him, eyes half closed. Not trust, not yet, but surrender. Arden blinked against the sting in her eyes, then reached out to stroke Shadow's neck. "You're teaching her," she whispered, "just like you taught me." Across the room, Lucas stopped painting. He stared at Luna, then at Arden. Then, voice cracked but clear, he said, "Can I draw her too?" And just like that, another silence broke. It began so quietly, Arden almost missed it. A brush of warmth at her fingertips. Shadow's head nudging into her palm as she reached down to tighten her wheelchair brakes. Not a command, not obedience. Contact. She didn't move, didn't speak. Just let her hand rest against his fur, feeling the low vibration of his breath beneath her skin. Shadow didn't flinch. He didn't freeze like before. He simply stayed. And that changed everything. From that morning forward, the gaps between them started to close wordlessly, gently. In the kitchen, he followed without being called. In the therapy barn, he waited with unshaken patience when a child needed Arden's full attention. And at night, he began choosing not the corner, but the floor beside her bed. The first time it happened, Arden had been staring at the ceiling, sleepless and full of questions she couldn't name. Then came the sound-soft pads on hardwood, a huff of breath, and the weight of him curling beside her in the dark. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "Thank you," and let herself sleep. But it was the mornings that carved the memory deepest. Because now, when her eyes blinked open and the light spilled through the window, she didn't wake to silence. She woke to the slow, steady thump of Shadow's tail against the Florence, twice, then still, a rhythm, a greeting, a promise that he was still here, and so was she. One afternoon, Elena stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching them nap in the sunroom. Arden had dozed off mid-book, her hand resting near the floor. Shadow's head lay under it, like a bridge. Elena said nothing for a while, but when Arden stirred awake and caught her mother's eyes, there were tears already glinting. "You saved each other," Elena whispered. And for once, Arden didn't look away. She nodded. Because it was true. The smell of roasted vegetables and cornbread filled the old ranch house, curling through its beams like a promise that this evening would be different. The dining table, once sterile and underused, now pulsed with quiet life. Elena setting down plates with her usual grace. Luis still in uniform but sleeves rolled up, carving slices of sweet potato pie like he belonged there. Arden, hair loosely braided over one shoulder, sat at the corner, her chair pulled close. And beside her always, beside her shadow, there was no ceremony to it. Just the soft clatter of forks, the clink of water glasses, the hum of a home beginning again. "So," Louise said, smiling over his cup, "how does it feel to be famous?" Arden snorted. "I'm not famous." "Viral, then," he corrected. "That clip of Shadow collapsing at your feet already hit 2 million views. People are calling him the dog who chose love." Shadow's ears flicked, unbothered by the attention. His head rested under Arden's hand, and when she reached for her cornbread, he tilted upward, as if waiting for a better offering. "Oh no," Elena warned. "Don't you dare feed him from the—" But she was too late. With a mischievous grin, Arden dipped a fingertip into the peanut butter jar left out for dessert and held it under the table. Shadow licked it delicately from her palms low, deliberate, like a memory unfolding. And Arden laughed. Not a breathy chuckle, not the polite kind she used in therapy, but a full, bright, belly-deep laugh that stopped everyone mid-sentence. Elena looked up, startled. Louise smiled wide. Arden touched her lips in surprise. "Sorry, that was loud." "No," Elena said, blinking fast. "That was beautiful." Shadow leaned into her side, as if agreeing. Outside, the porch light flickered on against the dusk. Crickets sang from the tall grass near the fence line, a quiet chorus carrying through the air like an old lullaby. The breeze rustled the trees gently, stirring the chimes that hung near the front window. No sirens tonight, no raised voices, no fear creeping under the door. The wind carried no stormanly peace. Inside that small, weathered house, the air was thick with something sacred. Not silence, exactly, but stillness. The kind that only comes after a long journey through chaos, after wounds begin to close, after you've learned how to breathe again. The living room held mismatched blankets, scuffed wood floors, and the faint smell of chamomile tea. A dog lay by the fireplace's coat dark and thick, his ears twitching at every sound, but his eyes soft, heavy with trust. At his side, a girl's hand rested lightly against his fur, rising and falling with each breath, like a promise being kept. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Elsewhere in the house, laughter floated from the kitchen, where Elena stirred something sweet on the stove, and Micah cautiously peeled an apple at the table. Sheriff Hayes leaned against the doorframe, watching like a man who'd seen too much, but still believed in redemption. Someone had put on an old record, and the melody filled the corners of the room like light after rain. No one here had been unscarred. Each had walked through fire in their own way. Arden had faced her ghosts. Shadow had defied his training. Micah had survived the kind of sorrow no child should know. But here, together, they weren't survivors anymore. They were something more. And in that house built not of bricks but of trust and memory and second chances, no one had to say aloud what they all knew in their bones. This was family. Not by blood, not by duty, but by choice. The kind of family that shows up when you're at your lowest. That waits outside your door, night after night, even when you push them away. That sits with you in silence, listens without trying to fix you, and never asks you to be anything but exactly what you are. A girl with a quiet strength. A boy with a healing heart. A dog who chose love over command. And so, as the stars blinked into the evening sky and the porch light held its vigil, something unspoken passed between them all. A truth not written in any official document. A vow not sealed in ceremony. They had found their way home, together, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. It started with a flicker. Arden had been staring absently out her bedroom window, the warm glow of her reading lamp casting long shadows across the room. Below, the yard stretched quiet and golden in the last light of dusk, framed by the fencing that now stood as both protection and promise. Then movement. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks again. A tree branch, maybe. But the figure didn't sway. It moved, with intent. Her breath caught. A man, hooded, cloaked in shadow, head lowered as if he knew the camera angles. He moved low, methodically, toward the back fence. She leaned forward, heart thudding. That gate hadn't been touched in weeks. It was where the utility trucks used to come through before the renovations. now sealed and padlocked with chain and bolt. But the man didn't seem to care. He knelt, pulled something from his coat. Metal glinted. Bolt cutters. Arden's voice caught in her throat. Her hand reached for the call button on her discone that alerted Elena's room, but she didn't press it, because Brutus had already seen. The big dog was at the bottom of the stairs like a bullet, muscles rippling as he launched himself at the door. He didn't wait for someone to open it. He slammed his shoulder into the old screen, forcing it open with a loud crack. Then came the bark. Low, guttural, long and echoing like a war drum in the night. Shadow stirred from Arden's bed, ears up. But it was Brutus who led the charge, a streak of black and tan slicing through the twilight like retribution. The man at the fence froze. Tu late. Brutus hit the edge of the yard like thunder, hackles raised, teeth bared. He didn't bite, but he didn't have to. The sheer sound and force of him were enough to make the intruder stumble backward, bolt cutters dropping with a clatter. "Hi!" Elena's voice rang out from below, already running toward the back porch. Luis was just behind her, flashlight in one hand, sidearm drawn in the other. "Get back inside!" he barked at Arden. But she was already at the hallway's end, peering down with wide, unblinking eyes. By the time Luis reached the fence line, the figure had vanished into the tree Lingon like smoke. But Brutus didn't chase. He stood guard at the gate, chest heaving, growl rumbling like distant thunder. As if warning, "Don't try that again." Luis crouched, picking up the bolt cutters with gloved fingers. "Professional grade," he muttered. Whoever this was, they knew exactly where to go. Elena pressed her lips together. "You think it's connected?" Luis didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward the broken lock, then back to the shadows. "I think we should double the cameras and move Arden's room away from the front-facing windows." Upstairs, Arden pulled the curtain closed with trembling fingers. Shadow pressed close to her leg, sensing what she couldn't voice. This wasn't over. Whatever they'd escaped had just come knocking. The woods behind the kennels held their breath. Twilight bled into darkness as Shadow moved like a phantom beneath the tree, sears up, nose low, every muscle drawn tight like wire. He had slipped from Arden's side without a sound. No command, no hesitation. Just instinct pulling him forward, into the shadows where something familiar, something unfinished, waited. The scent hit him first. Old, but unmistakable. The rust of leather gloves. A bitter undertone of sweat. The trace of fear underneath arrogance. Dorian. Shadow stopped at the clearing's edge. And there he was grime-streaked, torn coat hanging off his shoulders. One hand clutching a rusted fence post like it could still offer protection. His other hand held nothing. No collar remote. No weapon. Just that same twisted smirk he used to wear behind the mirrored glass. "You found me?" Dorian muttered, lips cracked. "Of course you did. Should have put you down when I had the chance." Shadow didn't growl. He didn't charge. He stepped forward, slow, measured, and placed himself squarely in Dorian's path. Eyes locked, still, unmoving. A wall with a heartbeat. Dorian's breath hitched. "Move!" he rasped. "I swear to God, move or I'll—" But the lie died on his tongue, because Shadow didn't flinch. Didn't Solver. Didn't obey. He just stood there between Dorian and the trees behind him, between the past and the possibility of another victim, not as a weapon, not as a threat, as a choice. Dorian's face twisted, the sneer slipping. "You were mine! I made you!" Shadow blinked. One step closer. Dorian's knees buckled. In the distance errands. Closer, Luis's voice calling out, boots crunching through underbrush. "Shadow, hold!" The moment cracked. Light flooded the edge of the clearing. Deputies stormed in, flashlights sweeping, weapons raised. "There!" Elena shouted. Dorian turned, but it was too late. Shadow didn't move until the cuffs clicked shut. Even then, he waited until Arden's voice finally broke through the trees like dawn. "Come back, boy. It's over." Only then did Shadow turn, not with pride, but peace. And behind him, Dorian was dragged back into the justice he thought he could outrun. The morning sun filtered softly through the porch slats, casting golden strips across the dew-slick grass. The air still carried the hush of a long night spent on edge, but something had shifted. The fear was gone. In its place, a quiet pride. Sheriff Delgado stood at the base of the steps, clipboard in hand, badge gleaming faintly under his vest. He looked down at the papers, then back up at the figure sitting beside Arden's wheelchair. Shadow. No leash, no muzzle, just calm eyes and a steady presence that said more than any affidavit could. We've run every check, interviewed the handlers, reviewed the footage. The sheriff cleared his throat. I've never filed one of these under Guardian by earned merit, but, well, there's a first for everything. He clicked his pen. It's official. Shadow is now registered under state code as a certified guardian canine. Full protection rights. No further ownership claims can be made. Arden didn't move at first. She just stared at Shadow, his ears perked, chest rising slowly, the wind ruffling the fur along his back. Then her hand moved, gently brushing the soft curve of his neck. You did it again, she whispered. You saved us. Shadow leaned into her touch. No dramatics. Just the quiet gravity of a soul who had found his place. Elena stepped up beside them, a mug of coffee in one hand, a folded newspaper in the other. She grinned through tears she didn't bother hiding. Guess that means it's time, she said, nudging Arden's shoulder with her own. We'll need to change the sign out front. Arden smiled, truly smiled. No longer the girl in the chair who needed protection, but the heart of a sanctuary led by those who had once been broken and chose healing instead. The morning sky blushed with the first strokes of sunrise's soft apricot and lilac bleeding across the edges of the clouds. Birds stirred in the treetops, and a low breeze rolled through the fields like a promise. Elena stood on a ladder, hammer in hand, sleeves rolled up, the wood grain warm beneath her fingertips. Luis steadied the bottom rung with one foot, shielding his eyes to watch. Below them, Arden sat in her wheelchair beside Shadow, who rested his chin on her knee. The German shepherd's tail thumped softly against the gravel with each strike of the hammer above. Thunk. Thunk. Pause. Elena leaned back just enough to see it fully centered, level, hand-carved and sealed against weather. A new wooden sign, aged intentionally to look like it had always belonged here. The letters burned deep into the cedar plank read, "Welcome to Hollow Grove, where broken hearts learn to trust again." Elena climbed down, slow and quiet. No fanfare. Just the weight of the moment filling the silence. Arden's eyes never left the sign. Something in her chest softened. A tightness uncoiling that had lived there for years. She reached out, brushing her hand over Shadow's head. "This feels right," she murmured. Luis gave a quiet nod. "It is." Now, behind them, the kennel stood quiet, but no longer cold. Grass had returned to the yards. The scent of antiseptic was gone, replaced by earth and hay and healing. And now, above it all, a sign that told the truth plainly. They weren't running from the past anymore. They were building something new. Together. The old pickup truck rumbled to a stop just beyond the archway of Hollow Grove, its tires crunching over gravel like slow exhalations. Elena stood waiting near the front porch, arms gently crossed, her stance both welcoming and protective. Shadow was beside Arden's wheelchair, perfectly still except for the flick of his ear at the engine's idle. The door creaked open. A boy stepped out. He looked no older than 11, shoulders too small for the duffel bag slung over one of them. His jeans were 2 sizes too short, and his eyes dark, hollow, restless, flicked from Elena to the house, to Shadow, to the horizon beyond. Micah. His social worker gave a polite nod, handed over a folder, and mouthed a quiet, "Thank you." Then, without ceremony, the truck pulled away, leaving behind a boy and the weight of something unspoken. Arden watched him, the way his feet hesitated just before the porch step. She remembered that kind of fear, the kind that didn't make a sound, the kind that lived in the spine and curled itself around the ribs. She wheeled forward slowly, Shadow moving at her side like a shadow of his own name. When they reached him, she didn't speak right away. Neither did Micah. Shadow sat. Then, without prompt, without command, he eased his body low, resting his head gently over Micah's sneaker, breathing slow, still, present. The boy flinched, but he didn't pull away. Arden's voice came soft but sure. "He knows what scared feels like." Micah's eyes flicked upused once. "He does?" She nodded. "He was scared. Just like you. That's how we found each other." Micah swallowed hard, throat bobbing beneath his collar. Then, hesitant, trembling, he crouched, laying a tentative hand on Shadow's fur. Shadow didn't move. Just let him feel. The wind moved through the trees, lifting a few fallen leaves that danced across the porch like children once silenced, now singing. From a distance, the new sign above the gate caught a sliver of sun. Legacy wasn't something written in stone. It was alive in each breath Shadow took beside the boy, in each quiet act of choosing to stay instead of run, in the way Arden's voice filled the space with steadiness that said, "You are safe now." And so it began again, not in grand gestures, but in stillness, in presence, in trust, earned one heartbeat at a time. The sky outside Hollow Grove had slipped into indigo deep velvet blue with stars just beginning to blink their way through the fading dusk. In the stillness of the upper floor, Arden sat by the old window, her wheels locked gently in place, her breath soft against the glass. She remembered this window, the way it once held her reflection like a question she couldn't answer. Back then, the world beyond it had felt far away, like it belonged to others. Children who ran, mothers who hummed, dogs who chased butterflies instead of ghosts. But tonight, it felt different. Below, the courtyard glowed under warm lantern light. Laughter floated uplight, unburdened. A child giggled. A dog barked twice and thumped its tail against the deck. Her mother's voice, low and melodic, hummed an old lullaby as she helped fold blankets near the fire pit. And in the center of it all was Shadow lying on his back, paws relaxed in the air, surrounded by children who no longer looked afraid. Arden smiled. She pulled her sketchbook closer to her chest, fingers resting over a drawing that was still warm from the pencil's glide. On the page, Shadow sat tall and gentle, a half circle of children curled around him, laughter sketched into every corner. He looked like what he had become. Home. She looked out again, blinking slowly as a breeze curled through the slightly cracked window. The scent of earth and smoke and something faintly sweet drifted in. Maybe cinnamon, maybe healing. And then, softly, barely more than a breath, she whispered, "You're not just my dog, you're my beginning." The words hung there for a moment, like dew catching moonlight. Down below, as if he'd heard, Shadow's ears twitched. He looked up toward the window, and his tail thumped once on the wooden porch, steady as a heartbeat. In a world often marked by scars, both visible and unseen, sometimes healing begins with a paw print. This story was never just about pain or survival. It was about the quiet courage of a girl who found her voice again, and a broken German shepherd who learned to trust the gentleness of a child's touch. Shadow's journey reminds us that animals are not tools, they are souls. Loyal, intelligent, deeply feeling, especially German shepherds, whose bravery is matched only by their desire to love and protect. When given the chance, they don't just serve us, they stand beside us, carry our burdens, and sometimes lead us back to ourselves. Hollow Grove became more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary where broken spirits, both human and canine, could begin again, where fear was replaced with laughter, and trust was rebuilt step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. May we all carry forward the message of this story, that love, unconditional, patient, and kind, can rewrite even the most painful past, that every second chance begins with someone choosing compassion, and that sometimes family isn't who we're born to, it's who we fight for, heal with, and come home to, always.